Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the reign of King Æthelheard of Wessex, a disputed monarch who fought tooth and nail for his crown during one of Anglo-Saxon England's most turbulent and uncertain periods, the age of Mercian supremacy from 726 to 740. We'll softly explore the dramatic succession crisis that erupted when the great King Ine unexpectedly abdicated his throne. From the year-long struggle between rival claimants fighting for legitimacy and power, to 14 long years of complicated rule under the looming shadow of mighty Mercia and its formidable king, and finally, to a legacy of quiet endurance and stubborn perseverance that preserved the kingdom for future generations, all while the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England vied desperately for dominance and survival across the misty ancient land. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which early medieval English king or queen you'd like to hear about next in our Sleepy Crown series, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way every week. So cozy up, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow these gentle whispers from 8th century Wessex to lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Æthelheard, later known as King Æthelheard of Wessex, emerged from the shadows and obscurity of history during one of the most uncertain and dangerous transitions in the long, complicated story of West Saxon royal succession. His path to kingship would be neither smooth nor uncontested, marked by violence and political maneuvering, and his reign would unfold during a period when the mighty kingdom of Mercia cast its long, dark shadow across all of southern England, dominating the political landscape like a colossus. But to truly understand Æthelheard's story, to comprehend the challenges he faced, the choices he made, and the legacy he left behind, we must first journey back to the kingdom he would inherit. We must explore the Wessex that existed before his rule, a realm that had reached remarkable heights of power and prosperity under his illustrious predecessor, only to be left suddenly, unexpectedly, and dangerously without clear leadership, when that great king made the momentous decision to choose the salvation of his immortal soul over the continued governance of his earthly realm. The kingdom of Wessex, in the early 8th century, stood proud as one of the great powers of Anglo-Saxon England, a realm of considerable size and growing sophistication, stretching from the ancient forests and fertile valleys of the Thames in the east, westward across rolling hills and rich farmland, all the way to the rugged, windswept coasts where Celtic Britain still lingered stubbornly in the remote regions of Devon and Cornwall. Wessex had been shaped and moulded over generations by warfare, expansion, migration, and the slow but steady march of Christian civilization into what had once been thoroughly pagan lands. The West Saxons, as the inhabitants of this kingdom called themselves with considerable pride, traced their royal lineage all the way back to the legendary figure of Cerdic, a semi-mythical warrior king who was said to have first landed with his band of fighters on the shores of what is now Hampshire, sometime in the late 5th century, perhaps around the year 495. Whether Cerdic was truly the founder of Wessex, as later tradition claimed, or whether this origin story was carefully crafted by later generations of kings seeking to give divine legitimacy and ancient pedigree to their royal power, the kings who came after him wrapped themselves securely in the cloak of this claimed descent, using it to justify their right to rule. By the time of King Ine's accession to the throne in the year 689, Wessex had already endured many long centuries of near-constant struggle, bloody warfare against the native Britons, who had held these lands since time immemorial before the Saxon arrival. Desperate conflicts against rival Saxon kingdoms that had emerged to the east and south, and an ongoing, exhausting rivalry with the rising power of Mercia to the north. Yet under Ine, who would reign for an extraordinary and unprecedented 37 years, the kingdom entered what many would later remember with great fondness as a true golden age, a period of peace, prosperity, and remarkable achievement. King Ine was a ruler of truly remarkable vision, capability, and wisdom. He was not merely a warrior king, though he certainly led armies when necessary and expanded his borders through military conquest when opportunities presented themselves. He was also a thoughtful lawgiver who established comprehensive legal codes, a generous patron of the church who enriched monasteries and supported bishops, a builder of towns who understood the importance of trade and commerce, and a skilled administrator who transformed the often chaotic, improvised patchwork of Saxon governance into something far more organized, predictable, and enduring. Around the year 694, still early in his long reign, Ine promulgated a comprehensive written code of laws, the first such systematic legal framework issued by any Anglo-Saxon king outside the ancient kingdom of Kent in the far southeast. These laws, carefully crafted with a wise council of bishops who understood Christian principles of justice, powerful nobles who knew the practical realities of governance, and his own father Kenred, who brought decades of experience, addressed virtually every aspect of life in the kingdom, from the theft of livestock and the punishment of criminals to the obligations of military service and the settling of land disputes, from the rights of slaves and freedmen to the protection of the church's growing interests and properties. What made Ine's laws particularly notable and historically significant was their fundamental humanity and their sophisticated recognition of the complex social reality that existed in 8th century Wessex. The kingdom was not inhabited solely by Anglo-Saxons, who had migrated from the continent generations earlier, but also included very significant populations of native Britons, the direct descendants of those who had held these lands since Roman times and even before, long before the Germanic migrations had brought new peoples to the island. Rather than treating these Welsh-speaking people as mere subjects without any legal rights or protections, Ine's laws carefully distinguished between different classes and ranks of society, providing legal protections and remedies based on a person's status and wealth, rather than purely on their ethnic origin or ancestry. A Welsh freeman living in Ine's Wessex had genuine legal standing in the courts and could seek appropriate compensation for wrongs done to him, though the specific amounts of compensation might differ somewhat from those granted to Saxons of equivalent rank and station. This careful balance between Saxon political dominance and British legal rights helped maintain stability and peace in the western portions of the kingdom, particularly in the newly conquered region of Devon, where the native British population remained numerous, influential, and potentially troublesome if badly governed. Under Ine's careful governance and wise administration, trade flourished throughout all of Wessex's territories. The settlement at Hamwick, the place we now know as Southampton, grew rapidly into a major trading port along the prosperous southern coast. Here, in this bustling centre of commerce, merchants from Francia and from lands even further away brought glass vessels of remarkable quality, fine pottery decorated with intricate designs, luxurious textiles woven with skill, and countless other goods, exchanging them eagerly for English wool that was prized for its quality, hides and leather that were in high demand, metalwork that showcased Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship, and many other products of the island's busy workshops and productive fields. Archaeological evidence uncovered by modern researchers suggests that Hamwick, in its prime, may have held as many as 5,000 inhabitants, an enormous number for this period, making it one of the largest and most important urban centres anywhere in Anglo-Saxon England. Streets lined with busy workshops would have echoed constantly with the sounds of productive labour. Metal workers hammering bronze and iron into useful objects, weavers working their looms to create cloth, leather workers tanning hides and fashioning them into shoes and bags, potters shaping clay, and merchants haggling vigorously over the quality and price of goods that had been carried across the sea from distant lands. And it was probably during Ine's prosperous reign that Wessex began the important process of minting its own coins, small silver pennies called sciatas that would facilitate trade and demonstrate the kingdom's growing economic sophistication. Though no coins bearing Ine's actual name have survived to reach modern times, the presence of distinctively West Saxon coinage in archaeological deposits from this period strongly suggests that the kingdom was developing the economic infrastructure and administrative capability necessary for what scholars would recognize as a mature medieval state. Beyond his impressive achievements in economics and law, Ine proved himself repeatedly to be an energetic and capable military leader when circumstances demanded decisive action. He expanded Wessex's borders steadily westward, pushing the frontier with the British kingdom of Dumnonia, roughly equivalent to what we now know as modern Devon and Cornwall, all the way to the River Tamar, which would remain an important boundary for centuries to come. In the year 710, fighting alongside his ally Nothelm of Sussex in a military partnership that demonstrated the diplomatic connections Ine had cultivated, he confronted King Geraint of Dumnonia in a significant battle. According to some historical accounts, Geraint fell in this hard-fought engagement, and the valuable lands of Devon passed firmly and permanently under West Saxon control and administration. Yet Ine's long reign was not one of unbroken expansion and constant triumph. The great king struggled mightily to maintain the impressive territorial gains that his predecessor, the warrior King Ceawlin, had won through aggressive military campaigns. The kingdoms of Kent, Sussex and Essex, which Ceawlin had briefly and violently brought under West Saxon overlordship through a series of brutal conquests, gradually slipped away from Wessex's direct control as local rulers reasserted their independence, and Ine found himself unable or unwilling to reconquer them. The powerful kingdom of Mercia to the north proved an especially formidable rival and constant threat, and there were several occasions when Mercian forces pushed aggressively into territories that West Saxons considered rightfully their own. In the year 694, Ine had been compelled to pay substantial financial compensation to King Witred of Kent, an enormous sum of 30,000 silver pennies that represented a significant portion of the kingdom's wealth, to atone for the violent death of Mull, who had been Ceawlin's brother. Mull had been killed during a rebellion in Kent back in 687, burned to death along with 12 companions in a deliberate act of vengeance, and the enormous sum Ine paid reflects both the seriousness with which blood debt was treated in Anglo-Saxon law and custom, and the delicate balance of power that existed among the southern kingdoms during this period. Despite these significant challenges and occasional setbacks, Ine successfully maintained his firm hold on Wessex's core territories, the heartland regions of Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset, and the newly consolidated Devon. His kingdom remained strong and cohesive. His comprehensive laws provided structure and predictable justice that people valued, and his generous patronage of the church helped deepen and spread the Christian faith throughout his entire realm, transforming what had been partially pagan lands into thoroughly Christian territories. Ine had been an active and enthusiastic supporter of ecclesiastical development throughout his long reign. He presided over important church synods, where matters of religious doctrine and church organization were debated and decided. He granted valuable lands to monasteries that would pray for his soul and the well-being of his kingdom. and he helped establish the organizational framework of the West Saxon Church that would serve the spiritual needs of his people for generations to come. The famous abbey at Glastonbury, already ancient and venerable by Ine's time, with roots stretching back, perhaps to the earliest days of British Christianity, received particular favour and generous patronage from the king. Later traditions would even credit Ine with founding the abbey himself, though in reality, he was more likely expanding and richly endowing an institution that predated his reign by many centuries. For nearly 4 full decades, King Ine provided stability, effective law, and generally successful governance to the people of Wessex. His remarkably long reign allowed institutions to develop naturally and take root, trade to flourish without constant disruption, and a strong sense of distinct West Saxon identity to solidify among his subjects. Those who lived under his rule knew prosperity by the standards of the age, and something that approached peace, at least compared to the constant warfare that had characterized earlier generations. Yet, as the 720s progressed year by year, and Ine felt the increasing weight of his advancing years, the aging king began to contemplate more seriously his approaching mortality and, more importantly, the fate of his immortal soul. Ine had no obvious heir waiting to inherit his throne, no son who could seamlessly and uncontroversially take the crown upon his death, no designated successor who commanded universal support. His wife, Queen Æthelberg, had apparently borne him no children who survived to adulthood, or perhaps they had never had children at all. The sources are frustratingly unclear on this crucial point. This lack of a direct, unambiguous successor would eventually create the terrible crisis that would bring Æthelheard dramatically to prominence. In the Christian worldview that dominated 8th century England, kingship was understood to be not merely a political office or secular responsibility, but a sacred trust given by God himself. A king was responsible not only for the earthly welfare and material prosperity of his people, but also for the spiritual health of his kingdom and the salvation of souls. As a man approached the end of his days, knowing that death could come at any moment, the question of where he would spend eternity weighed increasingly heavily on his mind and conscience. For a king who had wielded the sword of justice and the sword of war, who had ordered men into battle knowing many would die, who had passed sentences of death on criminals and enemies, who had taken the possessions and lands of the defeated, who had made countless difficult decisions that had cost lives. For such a man, the accumulated burden of sin could feel overwhelming and nearly unbearable. The Church taught that while faith in Christ offered salvation and hope of heaven, it was wise and prudent to demonstrate that faith concretely through acts of piety, charity, and devotion. And no single act of devotion carried more spiritual weight in the Anglo-Saxon imagination than a pilgrimage to Rome itself. Rome, the eternal city, was the beating heart of Western Christendom, the center of the faith. There, and the great basilicas rose magnificently above the ancient ruins of imperial glory that littered the landscape. There, in the church of St. Peter, lay the tomb of the apostle who had held the keys to heaven itself, according to Christ's own words. There, the Pope presided as the successor to Peter and the vicar of Christ on earth, wielding both spiritual and considerable temporal authority. A pilgrimage to Rome was understood as a journey to the very center of the faith, a demonstration of profound devotion that could help secure one's salvation. But for a reigning king to undertake such a lengthy and dangerous pilgrimage was no simple matter at all. The journey would take many long months, crossing hundreds of miles of sometimes hostile or dangerous territory. Wessex would be left without its experienced ruler for an extended period that might stretch to a year or more. And, as everyone knew all too well from numerous examples, many who journeyed to Rome, especially elderly men weakened by years of hard living, never returned to their homelands. Disease could strike travelers in foreign lands where they lacked immunity. Brigands and bandits might prey upon even well-guarded parties traveling through remote areas. Accidents of all kinds could turn fatal far from home and skilled healers. The mortality rate for such pilgrimages was sobering. Still, as the decade of the 720s advanced year by year, and Ine felt more keenly the weight of his accumulated years and sins, the call to Rome grew stronger and more insistent in his heart, and his predecessor Ceawlin had also abdicated specifically to make this sacred journey back in 688, receiving the sacrament of baptism in Rome itself before dying there peacefully, presumably having secured his eternal place in paradise through this final act of devotion. If Ceawlin could seek salvation in the Holy City, why should Ine not do likewise? In the year 726, after 37 long years on the throne of Wessex, after building a kingdom and establishing laws and enriching churches and expanding borders, King Ine made his momentous and shocking decision. He would abdicate his kingship, leave Wessex and all its responsibilities behind, and travel to Rome with his beloved Queen Æthelberg to spend his final days and months in the shadow of St. Peter's tomb, praying for forgiveness and hoping for heaven. The great chronicler Bede, writing his monumental ecclesiastical history just a few years after these events unfolded, recorded that Ine left his kingdom to younger men. This simple, brief phrase contained a world of meaning and consequence. Ine was stepping aside voluntarily, choosing to abdicate rather than waiting to be overthrown by rivals or to die in office. He was consciously entrusting Wessex to the next generation, presumably believing they would govern wisely. But notably, Bede did not say Ine left the throne to his son, or even to a specifically named successor whom everyone recognized. He left it to younger men, plural, indefinite, unclear. This vagueness in Bede's account would prove historically significant and practically disastrous. Ine had not publicly designated a clear heir before his departure. Perhaps he truly had no son who could inherit the throne. Perhaps there were multiple candidates of roughly equal legitimacy, and he could not or would not choose between them. Perhaps the king, focused intensely on his spiritual journey and eternal fate, simply did not wish to interfere in the succession process, trusting naively that the nobles and bishops of Wessex would choose wisely among the eligible æthelings, the princes of royal blood, who had some claim to consideration. Whatever his reasoning or lack thereof, Ine's departure created a dangerous vacuum of power at the very top of West Saxon government, and into that vacuum would step not one, but two claimants, each convinced he had the right and the destiny to wear the crown of Wessex, each prepared to fight for what he believed was rightfully his. And among those who watched the great king prepare carefully for his sacred journey was a man whose ancestry and origins remain frustratingly mysterious to historians even to this day. His name was Æthelheard, which means, roughly, noble stern, in the Old English tongue, a name that combined aristocratic pretension with suggestions of unyielding strength. Some later sources, writing with the benefit of hindsight and perhaps trying to provide this obscure figure with better credentials, would claim he was the brother of Queen Æthelberg, which would make him King Ine's brother-in-law. If this genealogical claim were actually true, it would have given Æthelheard an important connection to the royal family, though importantly, not a direct line of descent from previous kings, a connection by marriage rather than blood. On other historical accounts suggest something even more remarkable and unprecedented, that Æthelheard's ancestry was entirely unknown, that his family background was obscure or undistinguished, that he might actually have been the first king of Wessex in living memory, who could not trace his bloodline back through the generations all the way to the legendary Cerdic. If this was indeed the case, It would mean that Æthelheard's claim to the throne rested not on impeccable royal pedigree and ancient bloodlines, but on some other form of legitimacy, perhaps military strength and the loyalty of armed warriors, perhaps the crucial support of powerful noble families who saw advantage in backing him, and perhaps simply being in the right place at the right time with the right combination of ambition and resources when the succession crisis suddenly erupted. What we can say with certainty, based on the limited sources that have survived from this distant period, is that when King Ine and Queen Ethelberg finally departed for Rome in the year 726, beginning their long journey southward and leaving behind the only kingdom they had known, Wessex was left without a clear, universally acknowledged ruler. The great king, who had governed effectively for nearly 4 decades, was gone, departed to seek salvation. The laws and institutions he had carefully established remained in place and continued to function, but the throne itself stood empty, and the question of who should occupy it remained dangerously unanswered. And as word spread rapidly throughout the kingdom that Ine had truly left, that he would not be returning to reclaim his crown, that the throne of Wessex stood vacant and available, men of ambition, noble birth, military capability, and political connections began to carefully calculate their chances and quietly gather their supporters for what everyone sensed would be a decisive struggle. The year 726 marked one of the most uncertain, dangerous, and potentially catastrophic moments in the long history of Wessex. For nearly 4 decades, an almost unprecedented span in the violent, unstable world of 8th century Anglo-Saxon politics, the kingdom had known stable, consistent leadership under a single, capable, and generally successful ruler. Now, suddenly and unexpectedly, and that hard-won stability had evaporated like morning mist burned away by the sun. Into the power vacuum created by Ine's voluntary abdication stepped 2 men whose names would become forever linked in the historical chronicles as rivals and antagonists in a drama that would ultimately determine Wessex's immediate fate. One was Æthelheard, the mysterious figure whose ancestry remains unclear and controversial, even among modern historians. The other was Oswald, a man who could point with pride to ancient royal blood flowing in his veins, and who believed this gave him an unquestionable right to rule. Oswald's claim to the throne of Wessex carried considerable weight precisely because of his impressive lineage and royal pedigree. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that great compilation of annals and histories that would be assembled more than a century later during the reign of Alfred the Great, but which drew extensively on earlier records, oral traditions, and written sources, specifically noted that Oswald descended directly from Ceawlin, an early and highly significant king of Wessex, who had reigned during the late 6th century, specifically from about 560 to 591 or 592. Ceawlin himself had been one of the Bretwalda, those early powerful kings whom the great scholar Bede had identified in his ecclesiastical history as having held supremacy and overlordship over other Anglo-Saxon rulers across southern Britain. Though Ceawlin's reign had ultimately ended in military defeat and ignominious exile around the year 591, forced from his throne by rivals and dying in obscurity, his blood nevertheless carried immense prestige in the eyes of 8th century nobles and warriors. To descend from Ceawlin was to belong to an ancient, venerable royal line, to connect one's personal claim directly to the very foundations of West Saxon kingship and the earliest days of Saxon dominance in this region. The chronicle carefully traced Oswald's ancestry back through several generations of his family, establishing his credentials beyond any doubt. His father, according to these genealogical records, was named Ethelbald. His grandfather bore the name Sinibald. His great-grandfather was called Cuthwine, and Cuthwine's father was none other than Ceawlin himself, the famous Bretwalda. This genealogy he carefully preserved in monastic scriptoria and recited at important occasions to establish legitimacy, demonstrated conclusively that Oswald was no upstart or ambitious pretender, but a legitimate ætheling, a prince of unquestionably royal blood, with every hereditary right to compete for the vacant throne. Against this impressive and well-documented pedigree stretching back generations, what could Æthelheard possibly offer to justify his own claim? If the later tradition was accurate, and he was indeed Queen Ethelberg's brother, as some sources suggest, then he had the significant advantage of close association with the previous reign and Ine's successful rule. He would have been a familiar and trusted figure at court, someone who had personally witnessed and perhaps participated in how Ine governed the kingdom, and someone who perhaps had served in important positions of authority during those 37 years of relative stability and prosperity. Such connection to the previous king and his successful administration could be quite valuable in the eyes of nobles and bishops, who would ultimately play crucial roles in deciding the succession. These decision-makers might well prefer a candidate who represented continuity and stability, someone who would govern in the established spirit of Ine, rather than striking out in dramatically new and potentially dangerous directions. Familiarity, predictability, and proven experience could be genuine assets in uncertain times when the kingdom desperately needed steady leadership. Yet, if Æthelheard truly lacked direct royal descent from previous kings, if he could not trace his bloodline back through the generations to Cerdic and the legendary founders of Wessex, this would have been a very significant and potentially fatal weakness in his claim. The Anglo-Saxons of this period took bloodline and ancestry extremely seriously, treating royal descent as a sacred inheritance. The right to rule was widely understood to flow through family lines, ideally from father to son in an unbroken chain, or through other blood relationships when direct succession proved impossible. A king without proper, verifiable ancestry would always be potentially vulnerable to challenges from those who could claim better breeding and more legitimate descent from previous rulers. We cannot know with any certainty the exact arguments each man made to justify and promote his claim during the crucial months of 726. Did Æthelheard emphasize his practical experience and his close connection to Ine's successful reign? Did he promise explicitly to continue the policies and approaches that had brought prosperity and relative peace to Wessex? Did he appeal skillfully to specific noble families who had benefited from Ine's patronage and who might fear that change would threaten their positions? Did he offer concrete promises of land grants, honours, and positions to those who would support his bid for the throne? The fragmentary sources that have survived from this distant age unfortunately do not preserve these crucial details of political manoeuvring. Similarly, an Oswald's campaign for the throne is lost to us, except for his name, his genealogy, and the bare fact that he fought for the crown. Did he travel personally throughout Wessex in the months after Ine's departure, visiting the great halls of ealdormen and powerful thegns, reminding them constantly of his ancient, prestigious lineage, and suggesting that only someone of royal blood deserved to rule? Did he present himself as representing a return to the true, authentic royal line after what he might have characterized as an aberration under Ine? Did he offer his own promises of reward and advancement to those who would rally to his cause? Again, we simply do not know. What we do know with certainty, based on the terse but unmistakable entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is that the competition between these two ambitious men did not remain confined to the realm of words, political manoeuvring, and peaceful persuasion. The Chronicle records with its characteristic frustrating brevity that in the year 726, Æthelheard and the ætheling Oswald fought. The very fact that this conflict was considered important enough to merit explicit inclusion in the chronicle, which generally recorded only the most significant events, strongly suggests it was not merely a minor skirmish, but represented substantial, serious armed conflict that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Imagine, if you will, the dramatic scene as these two determined rivals gathered their forces and prepared for what both must have known could be decisive confrontation, and each would have reached out urgently to the ealdormen, the powerful regional nobles who governed shires and commanded substantial military forces. Each would have sought desperately the support of bishops and influential abbots, whose blessing could confer legitimacy in this thoroughly Christian kingdom, and whose lands and dependents could provide crucial resources for prolonged warfare. Each would have promised generous rewards, prestigious positions, and valuable grants of land to those who would pledge their loyalty and bring their armed followers to join the fight. The kingdom that Ine had held together so successfully through the force of his personality, the legitimacy of his long reign, and the respect he had earned through wise governance, now fractured dangerously along fault lines of allegiance and self-interest, and some regions of Wessex declared firmly for Æthelheard, perhaps viewing him as the candidate of stability and continuity. Other regions threw their crucial support to Oswald, perhaps seeing in his ancient bloodline the legitimacy that kingship required. And as warriors gathered from across the kingdom, as tensions mounted day by day, as both sides prepared for confrontation, the terrible possibility of full-scale civil war, that most devastating and destructive of all conflicts, loomed darkly over the land. Civil war in Anglo-Saxon England was particularly destructive and traumatic precisely because it turned neighbour against neighbour, brother against brother, family against family, in ways that other forms of conflict did not. The social bonds that held communities together, bonds of kinship, friendship, shared labour, and mutual obligation, were strained to the breaking point or broken entirely when men who had once drunk together in the mead hall, who had helped each other harvest crops, who had fought side by side against external enemies, now found themselves on opposite sides of a shield wall, trying to kill one another. When civil war erupted, fields often went unploughed and unplanted because farmers were called away to military service, or because they feared to work exposed fields that might be raided. Trade suffered dramatically when roads became dangerous, and no merchant could be certain whether the next town he entered would be held by friends or enemies. Churches, which often held considerable wealth in accumulated land and treasure, could find themselves targets of raids by forces that desperately needed supplies and had abandoned the normal restraints of law and custom. The very fabric of society began to unravel. The fighting between Æthelheard and Oswald likely began in earnest in 726, immediately following Ine's departure for Rome, and continued with varying intensity through 727 and into 728. Different manuscript versions of the chronicle, copied by different scribes in different monasteries at different times, place the culmination of their conflict in different years, a reminder that even the Anglo-Saxons themselves, when they later tried to construct a definitive and accurate chronology of events, found the records of this troubled period confused, contradictory, and difficult to reconcile. What form did this destructive conflict take? Our Anglo-Saxon warfare in the 8th century was a brutal, intensely personal affair, conducted at close quarters. There were no professional standing armies in anything like the modern sense. Instead, kings relied on a combination of household warriors, the loyal thegns and gesithers who ate at their table, slept in their halls, and received treasure and weapons from their hands in exchange for faithful military service, and the fyrd, the general levy of free men who owed military service to the king when called, and who would gather with whatever weapons and armour they could afford to defend the realm. When two claimants to a throne fought as Æthelheard and Oswald did, they would have led their forces in search of each other, trying to bring about a decisive battle that would settle the question of succession once and for all. Or they might have avoided direct confrontation while raiding each other's territories instead, burning farms and villages to demonstrate power and spread terror, stealing cattle and other livestock to deprive the enemy of resources, destroying crops to create hardship for regions that supported their rival. Occasionally, the conflict might revolve around control of fortified sites, the old Roman towns with their stone walls still standing despite centuries of neglect, or fortified royal manors that could serve as strongholds and bases of operation. The armies themselves would have been composed primarily of infantry, warriors fighting on foot with spears, swords, axes and shields, the famous Anglo-Saxon shield wall, and where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with their large wooden shields overlapping to create a formidable defensive formation, was the dominant tactical formation of the age. Battles often began with an exchange of missiles, spears thrown or arrows shot, followed by the terrifying moment when the opposing shield walls crashed together and men began the brutal work of trying to break through the enemy line with axe blows, sword thrusts, and sheer physical force. Such warfare was exhausting, terrifying, and deeply personal. Unlike modern combat where enemies might never see each other's faces, Anglo-Saxon warriors fought at arm's length, close enough to see the fear or determination in their opponent's eyes, close enough to hear their cries and curses, close enough to smell their blood. And victory often went not to the side with superior numbers or better equipment, but to the side whose warriors could endure longer, could maintain discipline when the shield wall began to buckle, could find the courage to keep fighting when every instinct screamed to flee. We do not know where Æthelheard and Oswald met in battle, if indeed they fought a single decisive engagement, rather than a series of smaller skirmishes and raids. We do not know how many battles they fought, how many men died in their struggle, which specific regions of Wessex were devastated by the fighting. The sources preserve only the barest outline of events, frustrating modern historians who wish for more detail. They fought. The conflict lasted approximately a year, and ultimately Æthelheard prevailed. But Æthelheard's hard-won victory came at a price. A terrible price that would define his entire reign and cast a long, dark shadow over Wessex for the next 14 years. For Æthelheard did not triumph through his own strength alone, did not defeat Oswald through superior military tactics or overwhelming force of arms or the righteousness of his cause. His ultimate success, his survival against a rival with better bloodlines and seemingly stronger claims, his ability to secure the throne of Wessex, all of this depended critically on help from outside the kingdom, help from a neighbouring power that would demand substantial repayment for its crucial assistance, help from Mercia. To truly understand the enormous significance of Mercian involvement in Æthelheard's desperate struggle for survival and his ultimate victory over Oswald, we must turn our gaze northward from Wessex to that great Midland kingdom that dominated 8th century England like an unassailable colossus, casting its long shadow across all the lesser kingdoms of southern Britain. Mercia had risen steadily to prominence over the course of the 7th century under a series of formidable, aggressive kings. By the time of Æthelhard's succession crisis in 726, Mercia was ruled by King Æthelbald, a monarch whose power, ambition, and territorial control knew few bounds, and who had systematically transformed his realm into the dominant force in Anglo-Saxon politics. Æthelbald had claimed the throne of Mercia in the year 716, seizing power after the death of his predecessor and immediately beginning a program of expansion and consolidation. Over the following decade, or through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and sheer force of personality, He had systematically expanded Mercian influence until he held effective sway over virtually all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms south of the River Humber, that great waterway that had long served as a natural boundary separating the northern realm of Northumbria from the southern kingdoms. This was an unprecedented achievement in the fractured, competitive world of Anglo-Saxon politics. Previous Mercian kings had certainly exercised power beyond their own borders, had extracted tribute from weaker neighbours, had installed puppet rulers in conquered territories, but none had matched Æthelbald's comprehensive, systematic domination of such a vast region. He had brought under his direct control or effective overlordship the kingdoms of Kent in the southeast, Essex on the Thames estuary, Sussex along the southern coast, East Anglia in the eastern flatlands, and now, with Æthelheard's succession crisis providing an opportunity, Wessex itself. The great scholar Bede, writing his monumental ecclesiastical history of the English people around the year 731, just a few years after Æthelheard's victory, stated clearly and unambiguously that all the southern provinces of England, with their several kings still nominally in place, were subject to Æthelbald of Mercia. This was no casual observation or exaggeration for rhetorical effect. Bede was a careful, meticulous historian who drew on reliable sources and cross-checked his information. His testimony, and given its proximity to the events in question and his reputation for accuracy, confirms that Æthelbald had achieved something truly remarkable: a practical supremacy over the complex patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had never been fully unified. What did it mean, in practical terms, for a king to be subject to Æthelbald? Anglo-Saxon politics in this period operated primarily on personal relationships and carefully calibrated hierarchies of lordship, rather than on impersonal bureaucratic structures or formal constitutional arrangements. A lesser king acknowledged a greater king as his overlord, much as a thegn or warrior acknowledged his lord, entering into a relationship that carried specific obligations and expectations. In practical, concrete terms, being subject to Æthelbald meant several things, each of which significantly constrained the independence and freedom of action of subordinate rulers. The subject king would be expected to attend the overlord's court on important occasions, demonstrating publicly his subordinate status for all to see. These ceremonial appearances were not optional social gatherings, but mandatory demonstrations of the political hierarchy. When Æthelbald held a great feast or assembly, when he needed to make important decisions that affected multiple kingdoms, when he wished to display his power and receive the homage of his subordinates, the lesser kings were required to present themselves to stand in positions of lesser honor, to acknowledge explicitly their inferior status. He would witness charters, those crucial legal documents recording grants of land to followers or to religious institutions, with his name appearing below the overlord's name, making crystal clear the hierarchy of authority. These charters were often preserved in monastery archives and could be consulted later to establish property rights, so the witness lists served as permanent written records of who held power and how different rulers related to each other. A king whose name consistently appeared below another's in charter witness lists was publicly and permanently acknowledging his subordinate position. The subject king might be expected to provide military support when the overlord went to war, contributing warriors to campaigns that might serve primarily Mercian interests rather than his own kingdom's needs. And this military obligation could be extremely burdensome, forcing a subordinate kingdom to expend resources and risk lives in conflicts that did not directly benefit them, and that might even weaken them by drawing away defensive forces needed at home. He could be summoned to councils where matters affecting multiple kingdoms were discussed and decided, though in such councils the overlord's voice would carry the greatest weight and his preferences would typically prevail. The fiction of consultation and collective decision-making might be maintained, but the reality was that the overlord decided and the subordinates acquiesced. Most significantly, the subject king ruled not entirely by his own right and authority, but by the permission and with the explicit or implicit support of his overlord. If he displeased the overlord through disobedience or excessive independence, he might find his kingdom suddenly invaded, his throne threatened by rival claimants who enjoyed Mercian backing, even his own life at risk. The relationship was fundamentally one, not of equals, but of superior and inferior, of protector and protected, of master and something very close to a vassal. This was the system that Æthelbald had painstakingly constructed over the course of a decade. The kings of Kent, Sussex, Essex and East Anglia all bent the knee to the Mercian throne, acknowledged Mercian supremacy, and governed their realms with the knowledge that they did so at Mercian sufferance. Even distant Northumbria, though not formally subordinate and still powerful in its own right, had learned through bitter experience to respect Mercian power and to avoid conflicts that might draw Æthelbald's dangerous attention. And now Wessex, having just lost its long-reigning respected King Ine, seemed perfectly positioned to be incorporated into this expanding Mercian hegemony. The succession crisis that erupted in 726 provided Æthelbald with a golden opportunity to extend his control over the last major independent kingdom in southern England. When Æthelbald learned of the succession crisis tearing Wessex apart, and we may be absolutely certain that his spies and informants brought him detailed current news of the conflict very quickly indeed, he immediately recognized the opportunity this chaos presented. Here was a chance to bring the West Saxons, who had maintained their jealous independence throughout Ine's long reign, and who represented the last significant autonomous power in the south, finally and permanently under Mercian control. But Æthelbald was too shrewd, too experienced in the ways of power, too calculating in his approach to simply invade Wessex, while it was distracted by internal conflict. Such a blatant invasion, however militarily feasible, would have united the West Saxons against him, giving both Æthelheard and Oswald a common external enemy that might allow them to resolve their differences and present a united front. Instead, Æthelbald chose a far more subtle and ultimately more effective approach. He would actively back one claimant against the other, making himself a kingmaker rather than a conqueror. By supporting Æthelheard's claim to the throne, and by providing the crucial assistance that would tip the balance in his favor, Æthelbald could present himself as a patron and benefactor, a source of legitimacy, a powerful friend rather than a threatening enemy. And Æthelheard, enormously grateful for Mercian help in his darkest hour of need, would naturally become deeply beholden to his benefactor. The relationship of obligation and dependency thus established would give Mercia exactly the leverage it needed over Wessex, without the complications and costs of outright conquest and occupation. How exactly did Mercian support for Æthelheard manifest in practical terms? The sources frustratingly do not spell this out in detail, but we can make reasonable inferences based on how such relationships typically worked and what resources Æthelbald had at his disposal. Æthelbald may well have provided direct military assistance, Mercian warriors who marched south to bolster Æthelheard's forces at crucial moments in the conflict. The presence of these Mercian troops, hardened fighters from a kingdom with a formidable military reputation built on decades of successful warfare, could easily have tipped the balance decisively in Æthelheard's favor. When Oswald looked across the battlefield and saw not just Æthelheard's West Saxon followers, but also the banners and shields of Mercia arrayed against him, his heart must have sunk. How could he hope to prevail against such overwhelming force? Beyond direct military aid, Æthelbald offered something perhaps even more valuable in the long run: political legitimacy and recognition. by publicly endorsing Æthelheard's claim to the throne, and by treating him as the rightful King of Wessex in official dealings and communications, by signalling to other kingdoms that Mercia recognized Æthelheard's authority, Æthelbald gave wavering nobles and uncertain bishops throughout Wessex a compelling reason to back Æthelheard rather than Oswald. If the most powerful ruler in all of England supported Æthelheard, who could credibly argue that Oswald had the better claim or brighter future? This endorsement carried enormous weight precisely because Mercian supremacy was so widely recognized and so thoroughly established across southern England. To have Æthelbald's approval was to stand on solid ground, to have access to resources and support that dwarfed what any single kingdom could muster. To lack it, conversely, was to court disaster and doom. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. Challenge Mercian interests and you will be crushed. Align yourself with Mercian goals and you will prosper. With this crucial Mercian support behind him, military assistance that strengthened his forces, political recognition that legitimized his claim, the implicit threat that opposing him meant opposing Mercia itself, Æthelheard gradually but inexorably prevailed in his desperate struggle against Oswald. The exact date of the final decisive confrontation remains uncertain. Was it late in 727 or early in 728? The chronicle's various manuscript versions disagree, and we may never know for certain. But by 728 at the very latest, the outcome had become clear to all parties. Æthelheard had won. He sat upon the throne of Wessex. The civil war was over. And Oswald. The chronicle records his death in the year 730, just 2 years after his decisive defeat. Significantly, there is no mention of violence or execution or murder in this entry. The chronicle simply notes that the ætheling Oswald died, with no details about the circumstances. Perhaps Oswald had submitted peacefully to Æthelheard, after realizing that further resistance was futile and hoping to salvage at least his life if not his ambitions. Perhaps he had retired from public life to a monastery, as defeated political figures sometimes did in this period. Perhaps he had simply died of illness or accident, as so many did in an age when life expectancy was short and medical care primitive. The sources preserve only the bare fact of his death, enclosing the final chapter on the man who had come so tantalizingly close to wearing the crown of Wessex, but who ultimately fell short. For Æthelheard, the immediate crisis had finally passed after approximately 2 years of bitter struggle. He had survived the succession war that might easily have destroyed him. He had defeated a rival who possessed better bloodlines and arguably stronger hereditary claims. He had secured the throne and could now turn his attention to the actual day-to-day business of ruling a kingdom, administering justice, collecting revenues, granting lands, maintaining the army, supporting the church, and all the countless other responsibilities that came with kingship. But as Æthelheard took up the full responsibilities and burdens of his hard-won office, he did so knowing that his victory had come at an enormous price, and that price would soon come due, requiring payment that would define and constrain his entire reign. For the Mercian support that had made his victory possible was not given freely or out of simple charity. Æthelbald expected repayment, and the form that repayment would take was Wessex's independence itself. The relationship between Æthelheard and Æthelbald of Mercia, forged in the desperate fires of the succession crisis and sealed with the blood of those who died in the civil war, would come to define every aspect of Æthelheard's entire 14-year reign in ways both visible and invisible. For while Æthelheard now wore the golden crown of Wessex and sat upon the ancient throne of his kingdom, and while he bore the title of king and commanded the respect due to that sacred office, he did not rule as a truly independent, fully sovereign monarch, making decisions solely in the interests of his own realm and people. His throne, though won through struggle and maintained through determination, rested fundamentally on Mercian support that had proven decisive. And Æthelbald of Mercia, that shrewd and calculating overlord who had made Æthelheard's victory possible, would most certainly not allow him to forget the debt that was owed, or the obligations that came with it. The nature of Anglo-Saxon overlordship in the 8th century was such that the superior king, the Bretwalda, who held supremacy over lesser rulers, could legitimately expect substantial, tangible benefits from his subordinates, and these benefits might take various forms depending on circumstances and the specific relationship involved, but all served fundamentally to demonstrate and continuously reinforce the hierarchy of power that existed among the kingdoms. The overlord's authority was not merely theoretical or ceremonial. It had to be made visible, had to be felt in practical ways, had to shape the actual governance and policies of subordinate realms. One of the most visible and psychologically significant signs of Æthelhard's subordinate status would have been his regular, mandatory attendance at Mercian royal assemblies held at various locations throughout Æthelbald's extensive realm. When the Mercian king held court to issue important charters granting land to loyal followers or to religious institutions, and when he needed to make major decisions affecting multiple kingdoms, when he wished to display his power and receive the formal homage of his subordinates in public ceremonies, Æthelheard would be expected to appear in person, to present himself before the Mercian throne, to demonstrate through his physical presence his acknowledgement of Æthelbald's superior authority. These assemblies were carefully staged political theatre, designed to make power relationships unmistakably clear to all observers. The seating arrangements, the order of speaking, the positions people occupied in the Great Hall, all of these seemingly small details carried profound meaning. Æthelheard would not sit at the high table as an equal, but in a lesser position. When charters were issued and witnesses signed, his name would be recorded among the witnesses, but always listed carefully after Æthelbald's, and sometimes with a title that made his subordinate status explicitly clear, perhaps described as sub-king or under-king, or some similar designation that indicated he ruled Wessex, not in his own absolute right, but under Mercian authority and with Mercian permission. These charter attestations, carefully preserved in monastery archives and cathedral treasuries throughout England, provide modern historians with invaluable glimpses into the political relationships and power structures of the period. When scholars today examine surviving documents from the 730s and 740s, comparing different charters and analysing witness lists, they can trace the intricate network of subordinate kings who acknowledged Æthelbald's supremacy through the very fact that their names appear on his charters, as signed in their own hands or marked with their seals. Beyond these ceremonial obligations that might seem purely symbolic to modern eyes, but which carried enormous weight in a culture that understood ritual and hierarchy deeply, Æthelheard almost certainly owed substantial military service to his Mercian overlord. When Æthelbald decided to campaign against the Welsh kingdoms to the west, seeking to expand Mercian territory or punish Welsh raids, or when he needed to deal with other enemies or threats, he could issue a summons to Æthelheard requiring him to provide warriors from Wessex to serve in the Mercian host. This military obligation could place severe strains on Wessex's resources and defensive capabilities. Men who should have been working their farms during the crucial planting or harvest seasons, who should have been available to defend their own borders against raiders or invaders, who should have been maintaining local order and protecting their communities, were instead obligated to march northward to fight in wars that primarily served Mercian interests rather than West Saxon ones. These warriors had to be equipped, fed, and paid from West Saxon resources, further draining the kingdom's wealth. and some of them, inevitably, would not return. Killed in battle, dying of disease in military camps, succumbing to infected wounds far from home. The absence of these warriors from Wessex also created vulnerabilities. If substantial forces were serving in Mercia or on Mercian campaigns, Wessex's own defences were necessarily weakened. Any enemy watching carefully might see an opportunity to raid or invade, while West Saxon military strength was depleted. This created a terrible dilemma for Æthelheard. He could not refuse Mercian demands for military support without risking Æthelbald's anger and potential retaliation. But meeting those demands left his own kingdom more vulnerable. There may also have been significant financial obligations flowing from Wessex to Mercia, though the sources are frustratingly vague about the specific details of such arrangements. An overlord might reasonably expect tribute payments, regular contributions of silver, gold, or valuable goods that acknowledged his supremacy, while also helping to fund his court and military operations. These payments served both practical and deeply symbolic purposes. Practically, and they provided the overlord with resources he could use to reward his own followers, maintain his household, and prosecute his wars. Symbolically, they reminded the subordinate king with every payment that he ruled by permission, that his kingdom's wealth was not entirely his own to dispose of as he wished. The tribute might take various forms. It could be a fixed annual payment, so many pounds of silver, so many measures of grain, so many head of cattle, or it could be occasional gifts presented on important occasions, when the overlord celebrated a victory, when he married, when his son came of age, when major festivals occurred. These gifts were not truly voluntary but expected and required, their absence likely to be noticed and resented. Beyond direct tribute, and the overlord might claim rights to certain revenues that would normally belong to the subordinate king. Control of important trading centres, the right to collect tolls on roads or rivers, a share of fines collected in law courts, a portion of income from royal estates. All of these could be claimed by a sufficiently powerful overlord, further reducing the resources available to the subordinate kingdom and its ruler. Most significantly, and perhaps most frustratingly for Æthelheard, his independence in both foreign policy and even certain domestic affairs would have been substantially constrained by the need to consider Mercian preferences and avoid Mercian displeasure. Major decisions that any truly independent king would make according to his own judgment and his kingdom's interests now had to be filtered through the question of how Mercia would react. Whom should Wessex ally with? Which neighbouring kingdoms should it cultivate as friends or view as potential threats? These questions of foreign policy could not be decided solely by West Saxon interests, but had to take Mercian preferences into account. If Æthelbald wanted Wessex to maintain friendly relations with a particular kingdom, Æthelheard had to comply even if he saw advantages in hostility. If Mercia viewed another kingdom as an enemy, Wessex could not offer it friendship without risking severe consequences. Even domestic matters could be subject to Mercian oversight or interference. Which bishops should be appointed to lead dioceses? Which monasteries should receive royal patronage? Which noble families should be elevated to positions of authority? All of these decisions, which would normally fall entirely within a king's discretionary authority, could potentially be influenced or even dictated by Mercian interests. A bishop who was loyal to Mercia rather than to Wessex might be imposed. A monastery that served as a Mercian outpost might receive special favour. Noble families that could be counted on to support Mercian interests might be promoted over those more independently minded. This pervasive oversight and constant need to defer to Mercian preferences created a suffocating atmosphere in which Æthelheard could never simply govern his kingdom according to his own best judgment. Every decision, every policy choice, and every grant of land or elevation of a supporter had to be weighed against the question: how will Mercia react? Will this displease Æthelbald? Am I operating within the bounds of what my overlord will tolerate? This was the harsh reality of Æthelheard's kingship from the very moment he secured the throne. He was Rex King, in title, bearing all the dignity and sacred authority that title conveyed. He could issue charters in his own name. He could hold court and administer justice. He could command his subjects and expect their obedience. But his power was fundamentally circumscribed, hedged about with limitations imposed by forces beyond his control. He ruled not as a sovereign, but as something uncomfortably close to a viceroy, governing Wessex on behalf of and subject to the will of the greater power to the north. And this must have been an intensely bitter realization for a man who had fought so desperately, so violently, and at such cost to win the crown. Æthelheard had risked everything in his struggle against Oswald. He had led men into battle, had made promises and forged alliances, had spent treasure and called in favours, had shed blood and caused suffering, all to become King of Wessex. And now, having finally achieved that long-sought goal, he discovered that kingship under these circumstances was a hollow prize, a position of responsibility without corresponding authority, a throne that came with all the burdens of rule, but only a fraction of its power. Yet perhaps in those early years following his victory, roughly from 728, when his position was finally secure through 732, when Mercian pressure remained relatively moderate, and the burden of overlordship did not seem entirely unbearable, Æthelbald, having achieved his goal of bringing Wessex into his sphere of influence, and having no desire to provoke rebellion that would require costly military intervention, appeared content to exercise his supremacy primarily symbolically, rather than intervening constantly and oppressively in the daily governance of West Saxon affairs. As long as Æthelheard faithfully acknowledged his subordinate status through regular attendance at Mercian assemblies, as long as he provided military support when requested, as long as he consulted Mercian interests when making major decisions, as long as he caused no trouble and made no moves toward independence, Æthelbald seemed willing to adopt a relatively light touch in his oversight. The Mercian king had many concerns and many kingdoms to supervise. He could not and did not wish to micromanage every detail of Wessex's governance. This relative freedom, limited though it was, allowed Æthelheard to focus on the essential everyday tasks of kingship that actually kept a realm functioning. He maintained and enforced the comprehensive law code that his predecessor Ine had established, ensuring that disputes were settled according to established principles rather than descending into blood feuds. He held regular courts throughout his realm to hear cases and settle disputes, travelling to different royal manors so that justice would be accessible to people in all regions, rather than concentrated in any single location. He granted lands to churches and to loyal followers, and creating and reinforcing the bonds of obligation and loyalty that held the kingdom together. These land grants were not merely administrative acts, but deeply personal transactions that created lasting relationships. When a king granted land to a warrior or nobleman, that man became the king's man in a special way, owing loyalty and service in exchange for the royal gift. When land was granted to a monastery or cathedral, the monks or priests would pray for the king's soul, interceding with God on his behalf. He collected the various revenues that supported his household and enabled him to fulfill his royal functions. Food renders from royal estates, tolls from markets and river crossings, fines from law courts, tributes from subject peoples. These revenues, gathered from across the kingdom by royal officials, were what made it possible for the king to maintain his warriors, feed his household, give gifts to reward service, and generally exercise the generosity that was expected of a successful king. He gave gifts strategically to reward loyal service and cement important relationships, understanding that generosity was one of the most important attributes of successful kingship in Anglo-Saxon culture. A king who could not or would not give gifts, weapons, jewelry, land, treasure, would quickly find his followers looking elsewhere for a more open-handed lord. The giving of gifts was how loyalty was purchased and maintained, how warriors were motivated to risk their lives, how noble families were kept satisfied, and how he presided over religious ceremonies that demonstrated the sacred nature of his office and the close relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority. When bishops consecrated new churches, when monasteries celebrated their patron saints' feast days, when major Christian festivals like Easter or Christmas were observed, the king's presence was expected and necessary. His participation in these ceremonies reinforced the idea that he ruled not merely by force or inheritance, but by divine right, as God's chosen agent for governing his people. In all these ways, judicial, administrative, ceremonial, religious, Æthelheard's reign continued and maintained the patterns and institutions established by his predecessor Ine. The governmental structures that Ine had built remained fundamentally intact and operational, and the kingdom did not collapse into chaos or fragment into competing territories. Life for most people continued with a degree of normalcy and predictability that must have been profoundly reassuring after the upheaval and uncertainty of the succession crisis. The historical record for these early, relatively stable years of Æthelheard's reign, from roughly 728 to 732, is frustratingly sparse and incomplete, which creates real challenges for anyone trying to understand this period in detail. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which remains our primary narrative source for 8th century England despite its many limitations, has very few entries for the late 720s and early 730s. After recording Æthelheard's fight with Oswald and then noting Oswald's death, the chronicle falls largely silent about West Saxon affairs until it records the catastrophic events of 733. This silence in the sources might suggest several different things. Perhaps nothing particularly dramatic or historically significant was happening in Wessex during these years. No great battles, no major political upheavals, no crises that seemed worth recording for posterity. The mundane work of governance, the routine cycles of justice and administration, the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, these ordinary realities might not have seemed worthy of inclusion in chronicles that typically focused on extraordinary events, or the silence might simply reflect the inherent limitations of the chronicle itself. The compilers who assembled this text more than a century later, and during the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, relied necessarily on earlier records, oral traditions, and written sources that were themselves incomplete. For some periods and some regions, they had abundant material to draw upon. For others, including apparently Wessex in the late 720s and early 730s, their sources were scanty or non-existent. They could only record what they knew, and apparently they knew very little about these particular years. What we can say with reasonable confidence, despite the paucity of detailed evidence, is that Wessex during these years maintained its basic identity, territorial integrity, and institutional structure. The kingdom that Ine had spent 37 years consolidating and strengthening remained recognizably itself. The borders that he had established, and stretching from the Thames Valley in the east to the Tamar River in the west, from the English Channel in the south to the disputed borderlands with Mercia in the north, remained generally intact and defensible. The church continued its vital work throughout the kingdom without apparent disruption. Monasteries where monks and nuns dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation maintained their regular routines of worship. Bishops oversaw their dioceses, ordaining new priests to serve in local churches, consecrating new buildings, settling disputes, that involved church property or religious matters. The process of Christianization that had been underway since the 7th century continued steadily, reaching into even remote rural areas where pagan practices might still linger. Trade and commerce are those engines of prosperity that had flourished under Ine's peaceful reign, apparently continued to function relatively normally. The port of Hamwick on the southern coast remained an active centre where merchants from Francia and beyond brought their goods to exchange for English products. Craftsmen in towns and villages continued their work, blacksmiths forging tools and weapons, potters making vessels, weavers producing cloth, leatherworkers creating shoes and bags. The seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, of feast days and fasts, of births and deaths, continued as they had for generations. But beneath this surface appearance of continuity and relative normalcy, beneath the routine functions of governance and the comfortable patterns of daily life, Æthelheard must have been acutely, yet painfully aware of his fundamental vulnerability and the precariousness of his position. He ruled at Mercian sufferance, holding his throne only because Æthelbald permitted him to hold it. If the Mercian king decided to assert his power more directly, to make more extensive demands, to interfere more intrusively in West Saxon affairs, Æthelheard would have very limited options for resistance. He could not realistically contemplate open rebellion or defiance. Wessex alone could not hope to defeat Mercia in a direct military confrontation. Æthelbald commanded larger armies, controlled more territory, had access to greater resources. Any West Saxon king who chose to fight Mercia would almost certainly face the same fate that had befallen other kings who had dared to resist: defeat, devastation of his kingdom, and quite possibly deposition and death. Nor could Æthelheard realistically hope to build alliances that might counterbalance Mercian power. The other kingdoms of southern England were all, like Wessex, subordinate to Mercia. Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, all bent the knee to Æthelbald. None of them would risk Mercian wrath by joining a West Saxon rebellion. And distant Northumbria, while still powerful and independent, was too far away and too preoccupied with its own concerns to provide meaningful assistance. Æthelheard's only realistic strategy, therefore, was accommodation and survival. He would acknowledge Mercian supremacy, would fulfill his obligations to his overlord, would avoid provocations, would exercise what limited authority remained to him as carefully and effectively as possible, and would hope that over time, circumstances might change in ways that would allow greater independence. It was not a glorious strategy, not one that would be celebrated in poetry or song, not one that would win him lasting fame, but it was realistic, practical, and perhaps the only path that offered any hope of maintaining Wessex as a functioning kingdom. And then, in the year 733, Æthelheard's worst fears were suddenly, dramatically realized. Æthelbald of Mercia, that shrewd and ruthless overlord who until now had been content with symbolic acknowledgements of supremacy, decided to demonstrate unmistakably and humiliatingly just how completely Wessex lay within his grasp, and just how little true power Æthelheard actually possessed. The Mercian king launched a military expedition directly into West Saxon territory, targeting one of the most important centres of royal power in the kingdom. And Æthelheard, watching helplessly as foreign warriors operated freely within his realm, could do absolutely nothing to prevent it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the disaster that befell Wessex in the year 733 with its characteristic, maddeningly terse brevity. This year, Æthelbald took Somerton. Just 6 short words in the original Old English. Her Æthelbald genum Somertun. Yet these few words convey a catastrophe for Wessex, a personal humiliation for Æthelheard that must have been almost unbearable. and a stark demonstration to everyone watching that Mercian supremacy was not merely theoretical or ceremonial, but ruthlessly practical and enforceable. Somerton was no ordinary settlement that could be lost without significant consequences. Located in the fertile heart of Somerset, in the southwestern region of the kingdom where the West Saxons had established their control during the expansion of previous reigns, Somerton was a royal manor, one of the most important centres of West Saxon power and administration outside the traditional heartland. Royal manors were special places where kings stayed when they travelled through their realms on the constant journeys that governance required, where they held court and administered justice, where revenues from surrounding estates were collected and stored, where royal authority was most visibly and tangibly present. A royal manor was not just a building, or even a complex of buildings, though it would certainly include a substantial hall where the king could feast with his warriors, sleep quarters for the royal household, storehouses for food and treasure, stables for horses, workshops for craftsmen, perhaps a chapel for Christian worship. A royal manor was a centre of power, a statement of royal authority, a demonstration that the king's presence and protection extended throughout the realm. People for miles around would look to the royal manor as a symbol of order and justice, knowing that the king or his appointed representatives could be found there to settle disputes, punish criminals, and maintain the peace. For the King of Wessex to lose control of Somerton was therefore not merely to lose a valuable piece of property or a convenient place to stay. It was to suffer a devastating blow to royal prestige and credibility, to demonstrate weakness and impotence before his own subjects, and to show that even in the heart of his own kingdom, he could not protect what was rightfully his. It was a message delivered unmistakably and publicly for all to hear. Æthelbald could take what he wanted when he wanted it, and there was nothing Æthelheard could do to prevent it. The military expedition that captured Somerton was almost certainly not a prolonged siege requiring weeks of preparation and massive forces, nor a massive invasion involving the full might of Mercian military power. More likely, based on how such operations typically unfolded in this period, Mercian forces, perhaps several hundred warriors, enough to overwhelm any local resistance, but not so many as to require elaborate logistics, marched south from Mercian territory, perhaps moving quickly to prevent organized opposition from forming, and occupied the manor with minimal actual fighting. Local authorities in and around Somerton, suddenly finding themselves facing well-armed Mercian warriors who clearly had their king's full support for this operation, may have quickly calculated that resistance would be futile and suicidal. The reeve, who managed the manor for the King of Wessex, the thegns who held surrounding lands, the ordinary people who worked the fields, all would have understood that opposing the might of Mercia was pointless. Better to yield without fighting, to preserve their lives and hope that the political situation might somehow change later, than to die heroically but uselessly defending a position that could not realistically be held. Perhaps there was a brief skirmish. Some local warriors, more loyal or more foolish than their neighbours, might have attempted to resist the Mercian occupation. If so, such resistance would have been quickly and brutally suppressed. Mercian warriors were experienced, well-equipped fighters who had participated in numerous successful campaigns. Any West Saxon forces brave or reckless enough to oppose them would have been swept aside with relative ease. Æthelheard, receiving urgent news of the Mercian incursion, perhaps carried by breathless messengers who had ridden hard from Somerset, faced an agonizing, impossible choice that must have tormented him. Should he gather his forces, call out the Fyrd, summon his warriors and loyal thegns, and attempt to drive the Mercian invaders out of his kingdom by force? This would mean open war with Mercia, a war that Wessex would almost certainly lose, given the vast disparity in resources and military power. Æthelbald's kingdom was significantly larger than Wessex, with a greater population to draw warriors from, more extensive territory providing resources and revenues, and decades of successful military campaigns that had hardened its warriors and perfected its tactics. A West Saxon army marching north to challenge Mercia would likely meet the same disastrous fate that had befallen other kingdoms that had dared to resist Mercian supremacy. Comprehensive defeat on the battlefield, devastation of territory as Mercian forces ravaged the rebellious kingdom, and quite possibly the replacement of their king with someone more pliant and obedient to Mercian wishes. Beyond the military calculation, there was also the bitter personal reality that Æthelheard owed his throne to Mercian support in the first place. He had become king only because Æthelbald had backed him against Oswald during the succession crisis. To now turn against his benefactor and overlord would not only be militarily foolish, but also a profound betrayal of the obligations he had incurred. Anglo-Saxon culture took such obligations very seriously. To receive help and then repay it with hostility was considered deeply dishonorable. The alternative to military resistance was to accept the loss, to swallow his pride and anger, and to acknowledge explicitly what had been implicit all along, that Mercian supremacy meant Mercian forces could operate within Wessex as they pleased, that Wessex's territory was not entirely Æthelheard's to control, that his authority existed at Æthelbald's sufferance. This was a profoundly humiliating position for any king, and a bitter admission of weakness and subordination. But it was also the realistic, practical option that preserved the kingdom and avoided a catastrophic war that Wessex could not win. Æthelheard, demonstrating either wisdom or weakness, depending on one's perspective, chose the path of submission and accommodation. Somerton would remain under Mercian control. There would be no military challenge, no attempt to reclaim by force what had been taken. The humiliation would be endured, the loss accepted, the subordination acknowledged. But the disaster of 733 went beyond even the loss of this single, strategically important royal manor. The sources indicate that Æthelbald was subsequently able to grant lands throughout northern Somerset and in neighbouring Wiltshire, as if they were his own personal property to dispose of at will. The king of Mercia was treating West Saxon territory as Mercian territory, rewarding his own followers with lands that should have been Æthelheard's to grant, disposing of West Saxon estates to benefit Mercian nobles and warriors. This was overlordship at its most intrusive and degrading. It went far beyond requiring ceremonial homage or demanding occasional military service or expecting tribute payments. It meant that Wessex's actual territory, the land itself, the fundamental basis of the kingdom's existence, was being treated as if it belonged to Mercia, northern Somerset and portions of Wiltshire, regions that had been firmly under West Saxon control during Ine's prosperous reign, that had been conquered and settled by West Saxons, that had been integrated into the kingdom's administrative and legal structures, were now effectively Mercian possessions. For the nobles and landholders in these affected regions, the change must have been profoundly disorienting and disturbing. They now owed allegiance not primarily to the King of Wessex, whose subjects they had been and whose protection they had relied upon, but to Mercian lords who held their lands by grant of Æthelbald. The ties of loyalty and obligation that had bound them to the West Saxon royal house, ties that might have been generations old in some cases, were severed or severely weakened. Their military obligations shifted northward toward Mercia. The revenues their lands generated no longer filled West Saxon coffers, but Mercian ones. From Æthelheard's perspective, this partial dismemberment of his kingdom had cascading negative consequences. His ability to reward his own followers and to bind powerful families to his cause through grants of land was correspondingly and seriously diminished. A king's power in Anglo-Saxon England rested very heavily on his capacity to be generous, to give gifts of treasure and weapons, to grant lands to loyal warriors, to reward faithful service. When territory passed out of his control, when estates that should have been available for him to grant to his supporters instead went to Mercian followers of Æthelbald, his resources for such essential generosity shrank dramatically. And when a king could not adequately reward his followers, when he could not offer land or treasure to those who served him faithfully, their loyalty naturally became more questionable. Warriors and nobles served kings expecting to be enriched by that service. If another lord could offer better rewards, their allegiance might shift. The bonds that held a kingdom together were fundamentally transactional in many ways. Loyalty was given in exchange for generosity. Service was rendered in expectation of reward. Undermine the king's ability to reward, and you undermine the very foundation of his authority. The loss of Somerton and the surrounding territories thus created a vicious, downward cycle that threatened to spiral out of control. Æthelheard appeared weak, incapable of protecting even his own royal manors from seizure. This perception of weakness made it harder to maintain the loyalty and confidence of his nobles, who naturally gravitated towards strength and success. And the actual loss of land reduced his tangible resources for shoring up that loyalty through the gifts and grants that were expected. The foundations of his rule, which had never been entirely solid given his questionable ancestry and dependence on Mercian support, were further undermined with each acre of territory that effectively passed to Mercian control. Worse yet, from Æthelheard's anguished perspective, there was virtually nothing he could do about any of this. He could not reclaim Somerton by military force without provoking a war he would lose. He could not prevent Æthelbald from granting West Saxon lands to Mercian followers without openly defying his overlord and inviting retaliation. He could not appeal to other kingdoms for help because they were all, like Wessex, subordinate to Mercia. He could only endure this situation, maintain what dignity he could muster under such humiliating circumstances, and hope desperately that over time, Mercian attention and pressure might shift elsewhere as Æthelbald found other concerns to occupy him. The year 733 thus marked an absolute low point in Æthelheard's troubled reign, and indeed represented one of the darkest moments in the fortunes of Wessex itself during the entire 8th century. The proud kingdom that had thrived and expanded under Ine's wise governance, that had developed sophisticated laws and encouraged trade, that had become one of the major powers of southern England, commanding respect from its neighbours, was now reduced to such complete subordinate status that its own royal manors could be seized with impunity and its territory granted away to foreign warriors. For Æthelheard, personally, both as a man and as a king, 733 must have been a year of intense bitterness and soul-searching. 7 years earlier, in 726, he had fought desperately for the throne, believing that kingship would bring glory, power, the respect of his subjects, and the ability to shape his kingdom's destiny. He had risked everything, his life, his followers' lives, his honor, in that brutal struggle against Oswald, and he had won, had secured the crown he sought, had achieved his ambition of becoming King of Wessex. But instead of glory and power, he had found something quite different. Instead of commanding respect as an independent sovereign, he was treated as a subordinate whose authority existed only at Mercian sufferance. Instead of shaping his kingdom's destiny, he found himself unable even to prevent the loss of important royal possessions. The throne he had fought so hard to win was looking increasingly like a seat of weakness and frustration, rather than strength and achievement. Yet despite this profound humiliation and the grim recognition of his limited power, Æthelheard endured. He did not abdicate the throne in despair, as he might have been tempted to do. He did not flee to Rome seeking spiritual consolation, as Ine had done. He remained in Wessex, continuing to exercise what authority remained to him, maintaining the daily functions of royal governance even as the strategic position of his kingdom deteriorated steadily. This stubborn perseverance, this determined refusal to simply give up, despite setbacks and humiliations that might have broken other men, would gradually become the defining characteristic of his reign, and perhaps his most admirable quality. In the immediate aftermath of the 733 disaster, Æthelheard had to pick up the pieces as best he could and continue governing. He still had responsibilities to his subjects who depended on him for justice and protection. He still had a household to maintain and followers to reward from diminishing resources. He still had relationships with the church to manage and religious duties to fulfill. The work of kingship continued regardless of personal feelings or political setbacks. And so Æthelheard continued, diminished but not destroyed, weakened but still functioning, humiliated but still persevering. The years ahead would bring no dramatic reversals of fortune, no miraculous restoration of Wessex's independence or territorial integrity, but they would demonstrate something perhaps more valuable in the long run: the quiet strength required to endure impossible circumstances with dignity, to maintain institutions and traditions even under severe pressure, and to preserve a kingdom through dark times so that future generations might have something to build upon when conditions improved. While the public and political dimensions of Æthelheard's reign were marked by struggle, subordination, and the constant shadow of Mercian dominance, his personal and domestic life reveals glimpses of the more ordinary human aspects of early medieval kingship. Here we find not just political calculations and military defeats, but marriage, partnership, piety, and the complex web of relationships that constituted the royal household, that extended family and collection of servants, warriors, advisors, and dependents who surrounded any Anglo-Saxon king. By the year 729, and quite possibly sometime earlier, though we cannot be certain of the exact date, Æthelheard had entered into marriage with a woman named Frithugyth. She appears in the surviving historical record not as a mere passive consort or decorative figure, but as an active participant in the religious and charitable activities that were expected of a queen in Christian Anglo-Saxon England. Her name itself is significant and revealing. Frithugyth combines the Old English elements frithu, meaning peace or protection, and gyth, which relates to war or battle. Thus her name might be translated roughly as peace battle, or perhaps better understood to mean one who brings or maintains peace through strength, an entirely appropriate and rather beautiful name for a queen, whose role in this warrior culture often included mediating disputes, promoting harmony, and using her position to prevent or resolve conflicts. We know frustratingly little about Frithugyth's origins, background, or family connections, questions that would tell us much about the political considerations behind the marriage. Was she from a prominent noble West Saxon family, chosen to cement Æthelheard's connections with powerful regional interests within his kingdom? Was she perhaps from one of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, married to Æthelheard as part of a political alliance designed to strengthen Wessex's diplomatic position? Or, and this is an intriguing though unverifiable possibility, was she from Mercia itself, perhaps chosen specifically to cement the relationship between Æthelheard and his Mercian overlord Ethelbald, giving Ethelbald a family connection into the West Saxon royal house? The sources maintain complete silence on these crucial questions, leaving us to speculate. But whatever her origins, whatever political calculations may have influenced the choice of bride, Frithugyth fulfilled the expected role of a queen in this period, with what appears to have been genuine commitment and success. Like Queen Ethelberg before her, Ine's wife, and possibly Æthelheard's sister, if the tradition of their relationship is accurate, Frithugyth appears in surviving charters and documents as an active donor of lands to the church and a participant in the religious life of the kingdom. It's important to understand that although many of the specific charters that record these donations are of questionable authenticity, having been copied and quite possibly altered, or even fabricated outright, by later monastic scribes seeking to bolster their institutions' sometimes dubious land claims, historians generally accept that the basic pattern they reveal is genuine and reflects historical reality. Frithugyth did give lands to religious houses. She did witness her husband's charters, adding her name and presumably her seal to important legal documents. She did participate actively in the governance of the kingdom in ways that were appropriate to her elevated status as queen. The most significant and historically important donation attributed to Frithugyth was a substantial estate at Taunton, located in Somerset, not terribly far from the royal manor of Somerton, that would be lost to Mercian control in 733. This valuable land, which would have included not just fields for cultivation, but also the people who worked those fields and all the revenues they generated, was granted to Winchester Cathedral, the episcopal seat of the bishops of Wessex, and one of the most important religious institutions in the kingdom. Taunton was not insignificant property to give away. This was fertile, productive land in a region that had been incorporated into Wessex during the territorial expansion of Ine's reign. For Frithugyth to grant such an estate demonstrated both her personal generosity and the considerable resources that were at her disposal as queen. And queens in Anglo-Saxon England typically had their own lands set aside specifically to fund their activities and give them financial independence, what later periods would call dower lands. These estates provided revenues that the queen could use for her own purposes without needing to constantly request funds from the king. Frithugyth's donation to Winchester Cathedral was remembered and valued for generations. Later kings of Wessex, Æthelwulf in the 9th century, Æthelstan and Edred in the 10th century, would expand upon this original donation, making additional grants to Winchester and specifically referencing Frithugyth's earlier gift in their charters. This continuity across generations suggests that Frithugyth's generosity was not forgotten, but became part of the historical memory of West Saxon royal patronage of the church, a tradition that later rulers felt obligated to continue and expand. Beyond these charitable donations that brought her name into the historical record, queens in Anglo-Saxon England served many other important functions that typically went unrecorded, but were essential to the smooth functioning of the kingdom. The management of the royal household alone was an enormous, complex responsibility. A king's household included not just his immediate family, but also his warrior band, the loyal Thens who fought for him and expected to be fed and housed at his expense. It included numerous servants who performed the countless daily tasks necessary to maintain a great establishment. Cooks, bakers, brewers, cleaners, stable hands, guards. It included craftsmen who produced goods for the royal household, weavers making cloth, smiths forging metal objects, carpenters building and repairing structures. It included advisors, priests, visitors from other kingdoms or regions, suppliants seeking the king's favor or justice. All of these people, dozens or even hundreds, depending on the size and prosperity of the royal household, needed to be housed, fed, clothed, and managed. They needed to be kept productive and content, their disputes settled, their needs met. This was fundamentally the Queen's responsibility, and it required considerable administrative skill, good judgment about people, and the ability to delegate effectively to trusted subordinates. The Queen oversaw the domestic staff who prepared food for the household, an enormous task. when feeding potentially hundreds of people daily. She managed the production of cloth and clothing, and ensuring that the household was properly dressed according to rank. She supervised the maintenance of royal buildings, seeing that repairs were made when needed. She managed storehouses where food, drink, and other supplies were kept. All of this required careful organization and attention to detail. Beyond these domestic responsibilities, the Queen held her own court in many respects. She had her own revenues from her dower lands, which gave her resources she could dispense independently of the king. This financial independence meant she could be generous to her own followers and clients, creating her own network of loyalty and obligation parallel to the king's. She could grant favors, provide patronage, support religious houses, help those in need, all from her own resources. And queens also played crucial diplomatic and social roles in Anglo-Saxon political life. They could serve as intermediaries and mediators, carrying messages between the king and his nobles when direct communication might be difficult or charged with tension. They could intervene on behalf of those seeking the king's favor, their pleas carrying special weight because of their position and their personal relationship with the monarch. They hosted feasts and social gatherings where political business was conducted in convivial settings, where relationships were built and strengthened, where the bonds of loyalty were renewed and reinforced. In a period when much governance happened through personal relationships and face-to-face interactions, rather than through impersonal bureaucratic institutions and written regulations, the social role of the Queen was genuinely significant and politically important. A capable, intelligent queen who understood the political landscape and who knew how to work within and through the networks of personal relationships could be an invaluable asset to her husband's reign, helping to maintain the complex web of loyalty and obligation that held a kingdom together. Whether Frithugyth played such an active political role for Æthelheard, whether she served as a trusted advisor and political partner in addition to managing the household, we cannot know with any certainty. The sources that have survived from this period do not preserve stories of her diplomatic interventions or detailed accounts of her political maneuvering. The kinds of records that would reveal such activities, private letters, detailed chronicles of court life, or memoirs, simply do not exist for 8th century England. But the very fact that Frithugyth appears in the historical record at all, that her name survived to be recorded by chroniclers and included in charters, that her donations were remembered and built upon by later generations, strongly suggests she was not a marginal or insignificant figure. She made an impression. She mattered. Her contemporaries considered her important enough to remember and record. One aspect of Frithugyth's life that is recorded with unusual specificity and detail is her pilgrimage to Rome in the year 737, approximately halfway through Æthelheard's reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which typically records only the most significant events deemed worthy of preservation, it specifically notes that in this year Queen Frithugyth travelled to the Holy City in the company of Bishop Frithugyth of Sherborne, one of the most senior ecclesiastical figures in Wessex. This pilgrimage was by no means a casual or simple journey. Rome lay many hundreds of difficult miles distant from Wessex. The route would have taken Frithugyth and her companions across the Channel, through the Frankish kingdoms that controlled much of what is now France, and either over the towering Alps if taking the most direct route, or around them through more circuitous paths. The journey in each direction would have taken months, perhaps 3 to 4 months of hard travel if conditions were favourable, longer if they encountered difficulties, or needed to wait out bad weather or political troubles along their route. For a queen to leave the kingdom for such an extended period, potentially 6 months to a year counting both travel time and whatever period she spent in Rome itself, required extremely careful planning and substantial resources. She would not have travelled alone or with just a small escort. Anglo-Saxon nobles travelling on pilgrimage typically brought substantial retinues for protection, assistance, and appropriate display of their status. Frithugyth's party would likely have included armed warriors to protect against bandits and brigands, priests and religious advisors, servants to handle daily needs, perhaps other noble women as companions, and certainly people responsible for managing money and arranging accommodations along the way. The expenses of such a journey would have been considerable. The pilgrims would need to pay for food and lodging at numerous stops, would need to provide gifts to local rulers whose territories they crossed to ensure safe passage, would need to have funds available for unexpected expenses or emergencies. They would likely have brought gifts to present when they finally reached Rome, valuable offerings to leave at the tombs of saints, donations to churches, perhaps presents for the Pope himself if they were granted an audience. Why did Frithugyth undertake this arduous, expensive, and potentially dangerous journey? The chronicle offers no explicit explanation, maintaining its characteristic silence on motivations and inner thoughts, but we can infer several possible and mutually compatible reasons based on what we know about pilgrimage in this period and about Frithugyth's circumstances. And pilgrimage to Rome was understood fundamentally as a profoundly pious act that demonstrated deep Christian faith and commitment. The opportunity to visit the tombs of Peter and Paul, the great apostles who had been martyred in Rome and whose remains were believed to rest in the city's ancient churches, was spiritually powerful. To pray at these sacred sites was to establish a direct, tangible connection with the earliest days of Christianity, with the men who had walked with Christ himself. To receive the blessing of the Pope, who was understood as Peter's direct successor and Christ's vicar on earth, was to receive a benediction of extraordinary spiritual weight for a queen deeply concerned with the salvation of her soul. And we should remember that virtually everyone in 8th century Christian Europe was intensely concerned with this question. Such a pilgrimage might seem not just desirable, but essential. The hardships of the journey, far from being obstacles to be avoided, were part of its spiritual value. To suffer for one's faith, to endure discomfort and danger in pursuit of holiness, was itself a form of penance and devotion. Additionally, Frithugyth may have been following a well-established pattern and tradition set by earlier royal women, consciously placing herself in a lineage of pious queens. Her predecessor, Queen Æthelberg, had made the journey to Rome accompanying King Ine when he abdicated in 726. For Frithugyth to do likewise, to undertake this same sacred journey, I would connect her to this tradition of royal piety and demonstrate that she was a worthy successor to earlier queens. There may also have been political or diplomatic dimensions to the pilgrimage that are not immediately obvious from the surviving sources. A visit to Rome could provide opportunities to meet with important ecclesiastical figures from across Christian Europe who gathered in the Holy City. Frithugyth might have carried letters or messages from Æthelheard to the Pope or to other rulers, using her pilgrimage as an opportunity for diplomatic communication. She might have discussed matters concerning the West Saxon Church with papal officials or other high-ranking clerics. The line between religious and political activity was often blurred in this period, and a pilgrimage could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The specific timing of the pilgrimage, 737, just 4 years after the catastrophic loss of Somerton and the humiliating demonstration of Wessex's subordination to Mercia, might not be coincidental. Perhaps Frithugyth sought spiritual consolation and strength in the face of her husband's political difficulties and her kingdom's diminished status. Perhaps the pilgrimage was an attempt to demonstrate that even though Wessex had suffered political setbacks, its royal house remained pious and worthy of divine favour. Or perhaps the timing was simply determined by practical considerations, the availability of suitable travelling companions, favourable weather conditions, the completion of harvest season, when resources were most abundant, rather than by any specific political circumstances. Archbishop Fortha's presence as her travelling companion and spiritual guide was not just appropriate, but essentially necessary. Fortha had been Bishop of Sherborne since 709, meaning he had held this important position for nearly 3 decades by the time of the pilgrimage. He was one of the most senior and respected ecclesiastical figures in all of Wessex, someone whose long experience and high status made him an ideal companion for a royal pilgrimage. A bishop travelling to Rome would have had valuable connections with other churches and religious houses along the established pilgrimage routes. He would know where pilgrims could expect to find hospitality, which monasteries welcomed travellers, which routes were safest, which local rulers were friendly to pilgrims, and which might be hostile. His presence would have eased the journey considerably, opening doors that might otherwise have been closed, and providing access to networks of support that existed throughout Christian Europe. His presence also lent additional dignity and legitimacy to the Queen's journey, making clear that this was not some impulsive adventure, but a serious, properly organised pilgrimage undertaken with full ecclesiastical support and approval. The fact that a bishop of Fortha's seniority and status was willing to accompany Frithugyth to spend months away from his diocese on this journey speaks to the importance and legitimacy of the pilgrimage. The year 737 might seem, on the surface, like an odd time for such a pilgrimage, coming as it did just 4 years after the disaster at Somerton, and the kingdom was still dealing with the consequences of that loss, still adjusting to the new reality of even more explicit Mercian dominance. Yet perhaps precisely because circumstances were difficult, the spiritual consolation and divine favour that might be gained from a successful pilgrimage to Rome seemed all the more valuable and necessary. Whatever her motivations, spiritual devotion, political calculation, personal need for consolation, following established tradition, or some combination of all these factors, Frithugyth successfully completed her pilgrimage to Rome and returned safely to Wessex. We know this with certainty because a charter dated to 739, just 2 years after her departure, records both Æthelheard and Frithugyth as witnesses, clearly indicating that she had returned from her long journey. Bishop Fortha also appears in this document, having likewise survived the arduous journey in both directions. That both Frithugyth and Fortha returned alive and apparently in good health was genuinely fortunate and by no means guaranteed. Pilgrimages to Rome in this period were notoriously dangerous undertakings with substantial mortality rates. Disease could strike travellers in foreign lands where they lacked natural immunity to local illnesses. Malaria was endemic in certain regions of Italy, particularly in the summer months. Food poisoning or dysentery could result from eating unfamiliar foods or drinking contaminated water. Injuries from accidents, falling from a horse, being thrown from a wagon, simple mishaps while travelling, could turn fatal far from home when infections set in and no skilled healers were available. Bandits and brigands posed constant threats along certain routes, preying on travellers who might be carrying valuables. Political instability in regions the pilgrims passed through could suddenly make safe routes dangerous. Rivers in flood could become impassable. Mountain passes could be closed by snow or avalanche. Ships crossing the Channel or Mediterranean could sink in storms. The list of potential disasters was long, and every pilgrim who departed for Rome knew that they might never return to their homeland. The fact that the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers thought Frithugyth's journey worth specifically recording suggests that contemporaries understood it as a significant and noteworthy accomplishment, not merely a routine trip. Her successful return would have been a cause for celebration and relief, both for her personally and for the kingdom that depended on stability in the royal household. Upon her return to Wessex after this extended absence, Frithugyth resumed her place at Æthelheard's side as queen. The sources record no further major events in her life after 737, which likely means simply that she returned to the routine functions and responsibilities of her position, rather than that nothing of importance happened. She continued to witness charters, her name appearing alongside her husband's on legal documents. She presumably continued to manage the royal household, oversee charitable activities, participate in religious observances, and fulfill all the various duties expected of a queen. And she stood by her husband through the remaining years of his troubled reign, providing whatever support and partnership their relationship offered. One notable and potentially significant absence from the historical record is any mention whatsoever of children born to Æthelheard and Frithugyth. The sources that have survived from this period make no reference to sons or daughters, no mention of royal æthelings who might succeed Æthelheard, no record of marriages arranged for royal children to create political alliances. This complete silence is striking and invites speculation about what it might mean. The absence of recorded children could be literal. Perhaps the marriage simply produced no offspring, whether due to infertility on one or both sides, or because children were conceived but miscarried before birth. Perhaps children were born but died in infancy or early childhood, a more tragically common occurrence in an age of very high infant mortality, when even royal children received medical care that was rudimentary by modern standards. Diseases that are now easily curable or preventable could quickly kill young children. Accidents, infections, malnutrition during difficult years, all of these claim countless young lives. Alternatively, the absence might reflect limitations in our sources, rather than the absence of children in reality. If Æthelheard and Frithugyth did have children who survived to adulthood, but those children did not go on to achieve positions of particular prominence or historical importance, they might simply have faded from the historical memory that was preserved in chronicles and other records. People who did not become kings themselves, who did not play major roles in recorded events, who lived relatively ordinary lives despite their royal blood, might not have seemed worth recording to later chroniclers, who were selective about what they chose to preserve. Yet the lack of any mentioned heir does seem significant, given that succession was such a critical issue in this period. If Æthelheard had a son who could be expected to succeed him, we might expect at least some passing reference to this person in the sources. The fact that when Æthelheard died, his successor Cuthred is identified only as his relative, rather than specifically as his son, suggests that there was no direct heir apparent waiting to inherit. This lack of a clear, direct heir would prove to be historically significant when Æthelheard's time came to an end. And just as King Ine's lack of an obvious successor had created the succession crisis that brought Æthelheard to power through violence and Mercian intervention, so too would Æthelheard leave the succession potentially uncertain when death finally claimed him. The pattern of disputed or unclear succession that had characterized Wessex at the start of his reign would continue, creating ongoing instability that weakened the kingdom's position relative to its neighbors. But these concerns lay in the future. For now, through the late 700s and 30s and into the final years of Æthelheard's reign, the King and Queen of Wessex continued their partnership, governing as best they could under challenging circumstances, maintaining the dignity of their positions despite political humiliations, and preserving the institutions and traditions of West Saxon kingship through a difficult period that must have tested their resolve and resilience repeatedly. The years following the catastrophic loss of Somerton in 733 were marked not by dramatic events that would capture the attention of chroniclers and echo through the ages, but rather by a grinding, persistent, exhausting struggle to maintain Wessex's basic identity and institutional integrity in the face of overwhelming and unrelenting Mercian pressure that never entirely disappeared. This was Æthelheard's true test as a king, not a single decisive battle or acute crisis that could be met with heroic action and resolved one way or another, but rather a long, grey twilight of steadily diminished authority that required infinite patience, constant flexibility, tactical retreats, and above all, a stubborn, almost obstinate endurance that refused to surrender, even when circumstances seemed nearly hopeless. The northern borders of Wessex, which had been fluid and contested throughout the kingdom's long history since the earliest days of Saxon settlement, became a particular focus of constant concern and anxiety during these years. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in one of its rare comments about Æthelheard's reign beyond the bare recitation of major events, tells us that he struggled to maintain his northern borders throughout the entire 14 years of his time on the throne. This was not a single conflict that could be won or lost, not a dramatic campaign with a clear beginning and definite end, but rather a continuous, wearing series of challenges, encroachments, disputes, and adjustments that never truly stopped. The northern frontier of Wessex ran through regions that we now know as northern Somerset, Wiltshire, and Berkshire, territories that formed a complex, contested borderland between West Saxon and Mercian spheres of influence. These lands held strategic importance beyond their intrinsic agricultural value. They controlled access routes between the two kingdoms. They contained important river crossings and trade routes. They were home to powerful local families whose allegiances could shift depending on which kingdom seemed stronger and more capable of protecting their interests. The precise location of the boundary between the kingdoms was often frustratingly unclear, defined more by customary understanding and the actual practical reach of royal power than by any formal demarcation or agreed-upon line on a map. And there were no border guards standing at clear checkpoints, no customs officials carefully recording who crossed from one kingdom to another, no modern conception of a fixed territorial boundary. Instead, the border was more accurately a zone of contested influence where power relationships were constantly being tested and renegotiated. In such ambiguous circumstances, Mercian expansion and encroachment could take many different forms, some obvious and violent, others subtle and gradual. Sometimes the pressure was overt and unmistakably military in nature, as with the direct seizure of Somerton that had so dramatically demonstrated Mercian power. Mercian forces might raid across the border, burning villages and carrying off livestock to demonstrate their strength and Wessex's inability to protect its subjects. They might occupy disputed territories and dare Wessex to try to expel them by force, but more often, the Mercian advance was far subtler, operating through mechanisms that were harder to resist because they involved no dramatic military confrontations. Mercian nobles might be granted lands by King Æthelbald in regions that West Saxons considered part of their kingdom, creating confusion about jurisdiction and authority. When these Mercian landholders arrived with their own followers and began exercising local authority, collecting revenues, administering justice, they were effectively extending Mercian control without any need for armies or battles. Disputes between local landholders in the borderlands, conflicts over property boundaries, arguments about inheritance, and disagreements about obligations and rights might increasingly be resolved by Mercian rather than West Saxon authority. If people living in these contested regions concluded that taking their disputes to Mercian courts would bring them better results or more favourable judgments than appealing to West Saxon justice, they would naturally begin looking northward to Mercia rather than to their supposed West Saxon king. Each such shift in allegiance, small in itself, contributed to a gradual erosion of West Saxon authority. Churches and monasteries in border areas, which often held substantial lands and wielded considerable local influence, might find themselves looking to Mercian bishops rather than West Saxon ones for leadership, guidance and protection. If a monastery could get better terms, more generous land grants, greater privileges, a stronger protection from Mercia than from Wessex, its abbots would naturally cultivate relationships with Mercian rather than West Saxon authorities. And since churches were major landholders and centres of education and culture, their allegiance mattered enormously. Trade routes might be gradually redirected to pass through Mercian rather than West Saxon towns and markets. If merchants found they could get better prices, more reliable protection, lower tolls, or other advantages by dealing with Mercian markets, they would adjust their routes accordingly. And since trade brought wealth and fostered urban development, controlling major trade routes meant controlling economic prosperity. As commerce shifted northward, so too did wealth and power. Each of these small individual shifts, a landholder seeking justice in Mercian courts, a monastery looking to Mercian bishops for patronage, merchants redirecting their caravans to Mercian markets, disputes being settled by Mercian rather than West Saxon authority, might seem insignificant in isolation. Any single such incident could be dismissed as unimportant, not worth fighting over, not representing any fundamental change in the balance of power. But collectively, cumulatively, over months and years, these countless small adjustments amounted to a significant, substantial northward erosion of practical West Saxon power and influence. The boundary between the kingdoms, insofar as such a boundary meaningfully existed, was gradually shifting southward. Regions that had looked to Winchester and the West Saxon king a generation earlier were increasingly oriented toward Mercia and its court, and Æthelheard, lacking the military strength to resist openly, lacking the resources to outbid Mercia for the loyalty of borderland nobles, lacking any powerful allies who might counterbalance Mercian dominance, could do frustratingly little beyond contest these changes diplomatically when possible, protest when Mercian encroachment became too blatant or egregious, and tried desperately to maintain whatever influence and authority he still possessed in the contested regions. This was exhausting, frustrating, ultimately dispiriting work that offered none of the satisfactions or glory that warrior culture associated with kingship. An Anglo-Saxon king was expected to win glory in battle, to expand his realm's borders through conquest, to pass on to his successor a kingdom greater and more prosperous than the one he had inherited. Kings were celebrated in poetry and song for their victories, for treasure won in warfare, for enemies defeated and territories conquered. Instead, Æthelheard found himself fighting a very different kind of battle, not for glory or expansion, but simply to preserve what remained, to prevent further losses, to hold some kind of defensible line against an irresistible tide that seemed destined eventually to overwhelm everything. There were no dramatic victories to celebrate, no treasure to distribute to eager warriors, no conquered territories to grant to loyal followers. There was only the grim satisfaction, if it could even be called that, of having survived another year without catastrophic collapse. The psychological and emotional toll of such a position must have been immense and wearing, and Æthelheard knew with painful clarity that he was presiding over a period of decline and diminishment. He knew that future chroniclers, if they remembered him at all, would note his losses and failures rather than celebrating any achievements or successes. He knew that the nobles of Wessex, and probably many common people as well, looked northward to Mercia with a complex mixture of fear, resentment, and perhaps grudging respect, knowing that their own king could not effectively protect them from Mercian demands or shield them from Mercian pressure. He must have endured countless small humiliations and frustrations, having to defer to Mercian preferences in matters where he should have had free rein to decide, having to watch silently as Mercian authority expanded in regions where West Saxon kings had ruled unchallenged for generations, and having to maintain cordial relations with Æthelbald, even when every instinct might have cried out for defiance and resistance, the constant need to swallow pride, to accept diminishment, to acknowledge his own weakness. This must have been a terrible burden for any man with normal pride and ambition. Yet we should not imagine that there were absolutely no limits to what Æthelbald of Mercia could or would do to Wessex. Complete conquest and total absorption of Wessex into Mercia, while theoretically possible if Æthelbald had been willing to commit the necessary resources and accept the complications that would inevitably arise, was apparently not his goal or intention. Perhaps he calculated shrewdly that a diminished but still existing Wessex, ruled by a compliant, dependent king who understood his subordinate position, was actually more useful to Mercian interest than attempting to govern the West Saxon lands directly as Mercian provinces. Direct rule would have required appointing Mercian governors or ealdormen to administer West Saxon territories, which would have bred resentment among the displaced West Saxon nobility. It would have required garrisoning Mercian troops throughout Wessex to maintain order and suppress resistance, which would have been expensive and would have tied down military forces that Æthelbald might need elsewhere. It would have eliminated the useful fiction that West Saxon kings still ruled their ancient kingdom, a fiction that made subordination more palatable for proud West Saxons and reduced the likelihood of desperate suicidal rebellion. Or perhaps Æthelbald recognized realistic limits to his power. Even Mercia, for all its strength and the extent of its dominance, had finite resources. Æthelbald had many concerns beyond Wessex, Welsh kingdoms to the west that required watching and occasional punitive expeditions, East Anglia and the other eastern kingdoms that might grow restive if oversight slackened, Northumbria to the north that remained powerful and potentially threatening, internal Mercian politics that required his attention, pushing too hard against Wessex, provoking the very resistance he sought to avoid, might not be worth the trouble and expense when he had already achieved effective supremacy through less drastic means. Whatever Æthelbald's reasoning and calculations, the practical result was that Wessex retained its basic identity and separate existence throughout the 730s. It remained a distinct kingdom with its own king, with its own laws and legal traditions, its own administrative structures and institutions, its own church hierarchy, its own sense of identity as a realm separate from Mercia. The fiction of West Saxon independence, however transparently hollow that fiction had become, was maintained. And this preservation of even formal, nominal independence gave Æthelheard something concrete to work with, some foundation upon which to build, some institutional continuity to maintain. Within the significant constraints imposed by Mercian overlordship, Æthelheard could still function as a king in meaningful ways. He could still grant lands to his followers from whatever estates remained under his effective control. Though the pool of available land had certainly shrunk, these grants created bonds of obligation and loyalty, tying nobles and warriors to his cause. The recipients became his men in a special, intimate way, owing him service and support in exchange for his generosity. He could still hold courts and pronounce judgments throughout his realm, traveling to different regions to administer justice in person. When disputes arose that could not be settled locally, conflicts between powerful landholders, serious crimes requiring royal attention, cases involving church property or complicated questions of law, they could still be brought before the king for resolution by rendering fair, wise judgments, by protecting the weak against the powerful when possible, by maintaining legal order and predictability. Æthelheard fulfilled one of the most fundamental and important functions of kingship, He could still perform the elaborate ceremonial functions that demonstrated royal authority and sacred kingship. When bishops consecrated new churches, when monasteries celebrated the feast days of their patron saints, when major Christian festivals like Easter and Christmas came around, the king's presence was expected and necessary. His participation in these religious ceremonies, dressed in royal regalia and surrounded by his court, reinforced crucial ideas: that he ruled by divine right and God's favor, that royal and ecclesiastical authority were intertwined and mutually supporting, that the social and political order reflected a divinely ordained hierarchy. Perhaps most importantly from a long-term perspective, Æthelheard's continued presence as king, his stubborn persistence in maintaining the functions and forms of West Saxon kingship, even under such difficult circumstances, preserved the institutional structure that would allow for eventual recovery. The mechanisms of governance, the royal household and its officials, the system of shires and local administration, the church hierarchy, the legal framework, the networks of obligation and loyalty, all continued to operate, however weakened. They did not disappear or collapse entirely. This institutional continuity mattered enormously. It meant that when circumstances eventually changed, when Mercian power finally waned, as it inevitably would, Wessex would still exist as a viable entity capable of reasserting independence and strength. There would be something concrete to build upon, institutions to expand and strengthen, traditions to draw upon, a sense of West Saxon identity that had survived difficult times. Æthelheard's reign, for all its frustrations and limitations, kept these possibilities alive. The religious life of Wessex continued to function and even flourish during these years of political weakness, providing stability and continuity that transcended the fortunes of individual kings. Churches that had been founded or endowed during Ine's prosperous reign carried on their essential work of providing spiritual care to communities, celebrating the sacraments, maintaining the rhythm of Christian worship that structured time and gave meaning to life. Monasteries where monks and nuns had dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation, maintained their regular routines, rising before dawn to sing psalms, and gathering throughout the day and night for communal prayer, copying manuscripts to preserve and transmit learning, caring for the poor and sick who came to their gates. Bishops presided over their dioceses with whatever resources and authority they possessed, ordaining new priests to serve in local churches scattered throughout the countryside, consecrating new buildings constructed for worship, settling disputes that involved church property or clerical rights, maintaining communication with Rome and other centers of ecclesiastical authority. The process of Christianization that had been gradually advancing since the 7th century, slowly but steadily reaching into even the most remote rural areas where older pagan practices and beliefs might still persist in some form, continued without any apparent major disruption. Indeed, the Church in many ways provided a degree of stability and continuity during this period of political weakness and uncertainty that secular institutions struggled to maintain. When royal authority seemed uncertain or contested, when kings came and went with disturbing frequency, when political alliances shifted and territories changed hands, the Church remained. Bishops and abbots often held office for decades, providing leadership that outlasted individual rulers. Monasteries accumulated lands and wealth that made them powerful actors in their own right, capable of exerting significant influence regardless of which king nominally ruled. Religious authority, grounded in spiritual rather than merely temporal power, could partially fill gaps left by weakened royal authority. When people needed justice or protection and found the king unable to provide it effectively, they might turn to bishops or powerful abbots for intervention. Churches could offer sanctuary to those fleeing violence or persecution, Ecclesiastical property enjoyed special protections under both secular and canon law. The threat of excommunication or other spiritual penalties gave church leaders leverage that did not depend on military force. Æthelheard's relationship with church leaders throughout his realm would have been absolutely crucial to maintaining his position and what remained of his authority. He needed their support, their public endorsement of his legitimacy, their willingness to work within the existing system rather than undermining it, and they, in turn, needed a functioning king who could provide certain services and protections that only secular authority could offer, even if that authority was diminished. The king could grant lands to churches and monasteries, enriching them and expanding their ability to carry out their religious and charitable missions. He could enforce church rights and privileges, ensuring that ecclesiastical property was protected and that secular authorities respected clerical immunities. He could use royal power to suppress heresy or deal with threats to church property. He could convene church councils and provide the secular backing that made ecclesiastical decisions enforceable. This mutual dependence between crown and church created a working partnership that helped both institutions survive and function despite political challenges. Even a king as constrained as Æthelheard could be valuable to bishops and abbots who needed secular support, and their support for him, their willingness to recognize his authority and work with him, bolstered his legitimacy and gave him a constituency that went beyond purely military or political considerations. The common people of Wessex, the vast majority of the population who were farmers and herders, craftsmen and labourers, slaves and freedmen, who made up perhaps 95% or more of the kingdom's inhabitants, likely experienced Æthelheard's reign as a time of relative peace and stability, despite the political subordination to Mercia that so troubled the king and his nobles. There is no record in our sources of widespread famine devastating the kingdom during these years. No mention of plague sweeping through communities and killing thousands. No accounts of internal rebellions or civil wars tearing the realm apart. The absence of major warfare within Wessex's borders, even if that absence reflected the kingdom's weakness and inability to resist Mercian demands rather than any positive achievement, at least meant that fields were not regularly burned, that villages were not constantly raided, that harvests could be gathered rather than destroyed. For peasant farmers whose lives centered on the agricultural cycle, ploughing and planting in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in autumn, surviving through winter, the greatest blessing was simply to be left alone to do their work without interference from armies or raiders. For most inhabitants of 8th century Wessex, the high-level political struggles between kings and kingdoms were distant abstractions that had little direct impact on daily life. What mattered in practical, immediate terms was whether their local lord was reasonable and not excessively demanding, whether the harvest was good or whether drought or flooding had damaged crops, whether cattle thieves could be caught and punished, whether disease struck the family or left them healthy, whether the parish priest was competent and the local church could provide the sacraments and the comfort of religion. On these everyday concerns that actually shaped most people's lives, food, shelter, health, family, community, spiritual welfare, Æthelheard's reign was neither dramatically better nor significantly worse than what had come before under Ine or what would come after under Cuthred. Life continued with its familiar rhythms and recurring challenges. Babies were born, were baptized in churches that their grandparents had worshipped in. Couples married, began farming their own plots or practicing their crafts. The elderly died, were buried in churchyards near their homes, were mourned by their families and remembered in prayers. Yet we should not romanticize this period or imagine it as peaceful and pleasant, simply because large-scale warfare was limited. Anglo-Saxon society in the 8th century was hierarchical, often harsh, and offered very limited opportunities for social mobility. At the bottom of the social pyramid were slaves, people who had been captured in war, or who had been born into slavery, or who had sold themselves into servitude to escape starvation. Slaves were property, could be bought and sold, had essentially no legal rights, and were entirely at the mercy of their owners. Though Christianity discouraged the worst abuses and held that slaves had souls that mattered to God, slavery remained deeply embedded in the social structure. Free peasants, while possessing legal rights and the status of free men, still owed heavy obligations to their lords. They owed labor service, working their lords' fields in addition to their own, maintaining roads and bridges, building fortifications when required. They owed various payments, portions of their harvest, fees for using the lord's mill or oven, fines when they transgressed rules. They owed military service when the Fyrd was summoned, having to leave their farms to fight in conflicts they might not understand or care about. Justice, while theoretically available to all free men, how was administered by an elite aristocracy who had their own interest to protect and who often judged cases involving their own followers or dependents. The system of vergild, compensation paid for injuries or killings based on the victim's social status, enshrined inequality directly into law. The life of a noble was valued far more highly than the life of a peasant. To kill a nobleman required payment of an enormous sum that might bankrupt entire families, while killing a peasant could be compensated for relatively cheaply. Women in Anglo-Saxon society had restricted legal rights compared to men, though the exact nature and extent of these restrictions varied depending on social class and specific circumstances. High-status women like Queen Frithugyth could exercise considerable influence and control significant resources, and as we have seen, but most women, especially those of lower social ranks, were subject to male authority, first their fathers, then their husbands, sometimes their adult sons if widowed. They could not hold most public offices, could not serve as warriors, could not normally represent themselves in legal proceedings without male guardians. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, perhaps 30 to 40 years on average, though the very high infant and child mortality rates that pulled down the average meant that adults who survived childhood might reasonably expect to live into their 50s or even 60s if they were fortunate. But death could strike suddenly and unpredictably at any age. A simple infection could turn fatal without effective medical treatment. Childbirth posed serious risks to both mother and child. And accidents, a fall from a horse, an injury while working in fields, a construction collapse, could easily prove deadly. Diseases that are now easily prevented or cured claimed countless lives. Agricultural life was precarious and vulnerable, entirely dependent on weather patterns that were beyond human control. A late frost could destroy crops just as they were sprouting. A summer drought could wither fields that had looked promising. Too much rain could lead to flooding that ruined harvests. Crop failures meant hunger, malnutrition, increased vulnerability to disease, sometimes starvation. And peasants had no savings or insurance to fall back on. No government assistance programs, no way to cushion themselves against disasters except the charity of their community or their lord. Within this broader context of Anglo-Saxon society, hierarchical, often harsh, always precarious, Æthelheard's reign was simply one more chapter in a very long story of kingdoms rising and falling, kings struggling for advantage and survival, and ordinary people trying to live their lives and raise their families within systems that were largely beyond their control or understanding. The specific details of whether Wessex was independent or subordinate to Mercia probably mattered far less to most people than whether they had enough to eat, whether their families were healthy, whether their communities were safe. As the decade of the 700s and 30s gradually drew to a close, and the year 740 approached, Æthelheard had been occupying the throne of Wessex for more than a decade, not as long as his predecessor Ine's extraordinary 37 years, but still a substantial period by the standards of 8th century Anglo-Saxon kingship, when many rulers held power for only a few years before death, defeat, or deposition ended their reigns. That Æthelheard had maintained his position for more than 10 years, despite all the challenges and humiliations he had faced, was itself an achievement of sorts, a testament to his persistence, his ability to navigate impossible circumstances, his refusal to simply give up even when the situation seemed nearly hopeless. He had survived the succession crisis that brought him to power. He had endured Mercian overlordship without provoking the kind of rebellion that would have brought destruction upon his kingdom. He had maintained Wessex as a functioning realm with intact institutions despite all the pressures working against him. And these were not the kinds of achievements that would be celebrated in epic poetry, or that would win him lasting fame among the great kings of Anglo-Saxon history. But they represented a different kind of success, the unglamorous, unheralded work of simply holding on, of keeping things together, of preserving what could be preserved through difficult times. The final years of his reign, which we will explore in the next chapter, would see him continue this patient work of preservation and survival. And then, in 740, his time would end, leaving the question of succession, that same troubling question which had brought such chaos when Ine departed, open once again for the nobles and bishops of Wessex to resolve. As the year 740 approached, bringing with it the end of Æthelheard's troubled but ultimately enduring reign, the King of Wessex had occupied his hard-won throne for 14 years, a substantial period that had seen him weather the initial succession crisis, endure the humiliation of Mercian overlordship, suffer the loss of important territories, and yet somehow maintain both his position and the basic integrity of his kingdom through sheer stubborn persistence. Many kings of this violent, unstable era ruled for only a few years before death. Military defeat or political intrigue ended their reigns abruptly. That Æthelheard had held his position for more than a decade, maintaining his authority however constrained it might be, was itself a noteworthy accomplishment that should not be dismissed simply because it lacked the drama and glory that Anglo-Saxon warrior culture celebrated. The historical sources for these final years of Æthelheard's life, from roughly 738 to his death in 740, are even more frustratingly sparse and fragmentary than for the earlier parts of his reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which provides our primary narrative framework for understanding this period, despite its many obvious limitations and gaps, offers no entries specifically about Æthelheard after recording Queen Frithugyth's successful return from her pilgrimage to Rome in 737. The Chronicle then falls completely silent about West Saxon affairs for several years, recording no events, no battles, no significant occurrences, until it finally notes with characteristic brevity, "This year died King Æthelheard in 740. This profound silence in our sources might reflect several different things. Perhaps these truly were quiet years, when nothing particularly dramatic or historically significant happened in Wessex. No great battles were fought, no major political upheavals occurred, no crises erupted that seemed worthy of recording for posterity. The routine, mundane work of governance, settling disputes, collecting revenues, granting lands, maintaining the household, performing ceremonial functions, might not have seemed interesting or important enough to merit inclusion in chronicles that typically focused on extraordinary events rather than ordinary administration. Or perhaps the silence simply reflects the inherent limitations and biases of the chronicle itself. The compilers who assembled this invaluable but frustratingly incomplete text more than a century later during the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, and relied necessarily on earlier records, oral traditions, and written sources that were themselves incomplete and selective. For some periods and some regions, they had abundant material to draw upon: detailed annals, numerous charters, rich oral traditions preserved and transmitted across generations. For other periods, including apparently the late 730s in Wessex, their sources were scanty or entirely non-existent. They could only record what they knew, and apparently they knew very little about these particular years in this particular kingdom. Despite the paucity of specific detailed evidence about these final years, we can sketch a plausible and reasonable picture of Æthelheard's life during this period based on what we know more broadly about Anglo-Saxon kingship, the patterns of royal behaviour in this era, and the specific circumstances of Wessex under Mercian overlordship. This picture, while necessarily somewhat speculative given the gaps in our evidence, is grounded in solid historical understanding of how 8th century kings actually functioned and what their daily lives and responsibilities involved. The king would have continued his itinerant existence, moving continuously among the various royal manors that remained under his effective control throughout Wessex's remaining territories. Anglo-Saxon kings in this period did not rule from a fixed capital city in the way that later medieval monarchs would govern from London or Paris, sitting in permanent royal courts surrounded by elaborate bureaucracies. Instead, they travelled almost constantly throughout their realms and staying at various royal estates and manors scattered across their kingdoms. This mobility served multiple important purposes that went far beyond mere wanderlust or restlessness. First, and most practically, it allowed the king to personally supervise different regions of his realm, showing his face to local populations, holding courts in various locations, making his authority visible and tangible rather than distant and abstract. Royal presence mattered in a culture where authority was fundamentally personal rather than institutional. When the king appeared in a region, stayed at the local royal manor, held court and administered justice, granted lands and received oaths of loyalty, he made his kingship real in ways that could not be achieved through written documents or deputies acting in his name. Second, this constant movement distributed the enormous burden of supporting the royal household across multiple estates rather than exhausting any single location. A royal household, which included the king himself, the queen, their immediate family, the warrior band of loyal thegns, numerous servants and craftsmen, visiting nobles and suppliants, priests and advisors, might include hundreds of people who all needed to be fed, housed, and otherwise provided for. No single estate could support such a large household indefinitely without being completely stripped of resources. By moving regularly from one manor to another, the king allowed each estate to recover and rebuild its stores of food, drink, and other supplies between royal visits. Agricultural production at each manor could continue normally throughout the year, and with the knowledge that the king would arrive periodically to consume a portion of the accumulated surplus, but would then move on before resources were entirely depleted. Third, this itinerant lifestyle demonstrated royal power and maintained the king's connection with the broader nobility and population. If the king never visited certain regions, if royal presence was absent for extended periods, local authorities might begin to act more independently, might start to question whether they really needed to defer to a distant king they never saw. Regular royal circuits through the kingdom reminded everyone of the king's existence and authority. Each royal manor where Æthelheard stayed during these travels would have sprung to bustling life during his visit. How local officials, the reeves who managed these estates on behalf of the crown, would have prepared carefully for the king's arrival, stockpiling food and drink, ensuring that buildings were in good repair, gathering any cases or disputes that required royal judgment, assembling people who needed to petition the king or present gifts or renew their oaths of loyalty. The king's arrival, announced in advance by messengers, would have been a major event for any region. The local population would have turned out to see their king, to demonstrate their loyalty, perhaps to seek royal favour or justice. The great hall of the manor would be prepared for feasting, with tables set up, fires lit in the hearths for cooking and warmth, benches arranged for the king and his companions, and storerooms would be opened and their contents brought forth. Barrels of beer and mead, preserved meats, grain for bread, cheese, dried fruits, whatever provisions had been accumulated. For days or even weeks, the manor would be transformed into the beating heart of the kingdom, the place where royal business was conducted and decisions made that affected the entire realm. Æthelheard would hold courts, hearing cases and pronouncing judgments. He would meet with local nobles and church leaders, discussing regional affairs and receiving their counsel. He would grant lands and issue charters, creating or reinforcing bonds of loyalty. He would give gifts to reward service, weapons to warriors, jewelry to noble women, grants of privileges to monasteries. He would receive gifts and payments from those seeking his favour or fulfilling their obligations. The ceremonial aspects of these royal visits were as important as the practical business conducted. The king would appear in full royal regalia, crown or diadem, elaborate clothing that demonstrated his wealth and status, perhaps a sword or other symbols of royal power. His appearance needed to inspire awe and respect, to remind everyone of the sacred nature of kingship and the vast gulf between a king and ordinary people. Even a king whose actual power was limited by Mercian overlordship could still perform royalty in ways that maintained the dignity and authority of the office. Then, after days or weeks, depending on the amount of business to conduct and the resources available, and the royal household would pack up and move on to the next manor. Carts would be loaded with the king's possessions, horses would be prepared, the long column of people and baggage would form and begin its journey to the next destination. Behind them, the manor would slowly return to its quieter routine, recovering from the expense and excitement of royal hospitality and preparing for the next visit, whether in a few months or perhaps not for a year or more. Throughout these final years, Æthelheard would have continued to fulfill his judicial responsibilities, one of the most fundamental and important functions of Anglo-Saxon kingship. The king was understood to be the ultimate source of justice in his realm, the final arbiter of disputes that could not be resolved at lower levels, and when conflicts arose that were too serious or too complicated for local authorities to handle, disputes between powerful landholders who could not be compelled to accept a local judgment, serious crimes like murder or theft on a large scale, cases involving church property where ecclesiastical and secular interests collided, complicated questions of inheritance or land boundaries. They might be brought before the king for his authoritative resolution. These judicial functions were not merely administrative, but deeply political and symbolic. By rendering fair judgments, by demonstrating wisdom and impartiality, by protecting the weak against the powerful when possible, the king fulfilled Christian ideals of kingship as divinely ordained guardianship of justice. By settling disputes peacefully according to law, rather than allowing them to escalate into blood feuds and cycles of revenge, he maintained order and stability that benefited everyone. By showing that he took justice seriously, he bolstered his legitimacy and authority even when his military or diplomatic position was weak. Even a king whose power was constrained by Mercian overlordship, who could not act independently in foreign policy or make major decisions without considering Mercian reactions, could still exercise considerable authority in the judicial sphere. Æthelbald of Mercia had no particular interest in micromanaging how Æthelheard settled disputes between West Saxon nobles, or how he punished criminals within Wessex, as long as West Saxon justice functioned reasonably well and did not create problems for Mercian interests. Æthelheard had genuine freedom of action in this domain. Æthelheard would also have continued to grant lands and privileges throughout these years, though the pool of resources available for such grants had been significantly reduced by the loss of territories to Mercian control. Each grant of land was not simply an administrative transaction, but a deeply personal relationship created between king and recipient. When a king granted land to a warrior or nobleman, that person became the king's man in a special, intimate way. He owed the king loyalty, service, military support when called upon. He was bound to the king by ties of gratitude and obligation that went beyond mere legal requirements. These networks of personal obligation and loyalty were absolutely fundamental to how Anglo-Saxon kingdoms functioned. There was no professional bureaucracy staffed by trained civil servants who administered the realm according to written rules. Instead, governance happened through personal relationships between the king and his followers, and between those followers and their own subordinates, creating cascading chains of loyalty and obligation that extended throughout the kingdom. By continuing to make grants, even if on a smaller scale than might have been possible in more prosperous times, Æthelheard maintained these crucial networks and demonstrated that he was still a functioning king who could reward service and create bonds of loyalty. Even diminished generosity was better than no generosity at all. Religious observances would have occupied much of Æthelheard's time and attention during these final years, as throughout his reign. The church calendar, with its elaborate cycles of feast days and fasts, structured time for all Christians from the greatest king to the humblest peasant. Major festivals, Christmas celebrating Christ's birth, Easter commemorating his resurrection, Pentecost marking the descent of the Holy Spirit, the feasts of important saints, required the king's presence and active participation. At these sacred times, Æthelheard would have appeared in full royal regalia, perhaps wearing his crown, certainly dressed in his finest garments, surrounded by his court and the leading nobles and church leaders of his kingdom. He would participate in elaborate church services, perhaps making offerings at the altar, certainly receiving communion, demonstrating publicly his Christian faith and his understanding that kings ruled by God's grace and favor. And these religious ceremonies served multiple purposes simultaneously. They fulfilled the king's spiritual obligations and demonstrated his personal piety. They reinforced the connection between royal and ecclesiastical authority, showing that kingship was sacred and divinely ordained rather than merely a matter of military strength or political maneuvering. They brought together nobles and church leaders from across the realm, providing opportunities for political networking and relationship building that happened in the context of worship but had practical consequences for governance. Throughout these final years, the relationship with Mercia continued to cast its long shadow over everything Æthelheard did, every decision he made, every policy he pursued. Æthelbald of Mercia remained the dominant power in southern England, his authority extending not just over Wessex, but over all the kingdoms south of the Humber. If anything, Mercian power was growing stronger rather than weaker as the 730s progressed. There was no realistic prospect of Æthelheard throwing off Mercian overlordship, no opportunity for Wessex to reassert full independence, no dramatic reversal of fortune waiting just around the corner. Yet Æthelbald's very success and security may have brought a certain stability to the relationship. The Mercian king, confident in his supremacy and facing no serious challenges to his dominance, had no particular need to constantly demonstrate his power over Wessex or to keep pushing for additional concessions and losses. As long as Æthelheard remained compliant, fulfilled his obligations, caused no trouble, and maintained Wessex as a stable and functioning subordinate kingdom, there was no reason for further humiliation or territorial loss. The situation, while far from ideal for Wessex, and deeply frustrating for any king with normal ambitions and pride, had reached a kind of equilibrium. It was sustainable, if not satisfying. Æthelheard could continue to function as king within his constrained sphere. Æthelbald could enjoy the benefits of West Saxon subordination without the costs and complications of direct rule, and so it continued year after year, with Æthelheard enduring circumstances he could not change and making the best of a bad situation. Did Æthelheard, during these final years of his life, reflect on his reign and find it satisfying or disappointing? Did he feel he had done his duty, preserving the kingdom through difficult times as best anyone could have? Or did he look back with profound regret, wishing he had been stronger, achieved more, left a better legacy for those who would come after? We cannot know his private thoughts and feelings, but surely any king who had endured what Æthelheard endured must have wrestled with such questions during quiet moments. Queen Frithugyth remained at his side throughout these years, having returned safely from her Roman pilgrimage. Together, they continued to fulfill the ceremonial and social functions of royalty, hosting feasts where the bonds of loyalty were renewed and strengthened, rewarding loyal service with gifts and honors, presenting a public face of dignity and authority, even when the reality of power was constrained and limited. As the year 740 dawned, Æthelheard would have had no way of knowing it would be his final year on earth, his last months as King of Wessex. There is no indication in the sparse sources we possess that he was particularly ill or facing any immediate danger that might have warned him of approaching death. His passing, when it came, seems to have been from natural causes, perhaps an acute illness that struck suddenly and proved fatal despite whatever medical care was available. Perhaps simply the accumulated toll of age and stress, wearing down a body that could endure no more. Perhaps an accident or injury that took an unexpected turn for the worse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the end of Æthelheard's story with characteristic, almost frustrating brevity. This year died King Æthelheard. No details of his final days or hours are provided. No deathbed speeches or dramatic final moments are recorded. No account of whether he died peacefully or in pain, whether he had time to make his peace with God and receive the last sacraments, or whether death came too quickly for such preparations. Just the bare, simple fact of his passing, noted for the historical record and preserved for us across more than 12 centuries. We do not know where Æthelheard died, whether at one of his royal manors while on his regular travels, whether at some location that had served as something like a capital, though no fixed capital existed, whether while travelling between estates, whether suddenly or after a lingering illness. We do not know if Frithugyth was with him when the end came, whether he died surrounded by his household and closest followers, or in some less comfortable circumstance. We can be reasonably certain that as a Christian king, an Æthelheard would have received the Church's final rites if time permitted: confession to wash away his sins, anointing with holy oil, the Eucharist received as viaticum, or food for the journey into eternity. These sacred rituals would have been administered by a priest or bishop, with prayers offered for his soul's safe passage to heaven and deliverance from the pains of hell. His body would have been prepared for burial according to Christian custom, washed, dressed in appropriate garments, perhaps laid out in state for a period to allow his subjects to pay their respects and mourn their king. Then he would have been buried somewhere in Wessex, though the sources frustratingly do not record the specific location. Perhaps at Winchester, the ecclesiastical centre of the kingdom, perhaps at one of the royal manors he had frequented, or perhaps at a monastery he had particularly favoured with his patronage. We simply do not know. With Æthelheard's death in 740, the question of succession arose once again. That same troubling question which had created such chaos and bloodshed when King Ine departed 14 years earlier. Who would now wear the crown of Wessex? The chronicle identifies Æthelheard's successor as Cuthred, described as his relative. The exact nature of this relationship remains unclear. Was Cuthred a brother, sharing the same parents? A half-brother from one parent but not both? A cousin descended from a shared grandparent? A nephew, the son of a sibling? The sources provide no clarification, and that Cuthred was identified as a relative suggests something important. Despite Æthelheard's uncertain ancestry and his possible lack of descent from earlier West Saxon kings, by the end of his reign, he had been fully accepted as part of the royal family. His kinsmen could legitimately claim the throne by virtue of their relationship to him. The legitimacy he had fought so hard to establish back in 726, which had been questioned and contested by Oswald's superior pedigree, was now sufficiently secure that his relatives could inherit it without apparent controversy. The transition from Æthelheard to Cuthred appears to have been peaceful and orderly, with no record of a succession dispute or civil war repeating the chaos that had marked Æthelheard's own accession. And perhaps the memory of that earlier conflict was still fresh enough that West Saxon nobles and bishops preferred a smooth transition over another destructive struggle. Perhaps Mercian oversight ensured that the succession proceeded without disruption. Æthelbald would have had no interest in another West Saxon civil war that might require his expensive intervention and create instability in a region he had worked to control. Whatever the reasons, Cuthred became king without apparent opposition, inheriting both the crown and all the difficult circumstances that came with it. The new king faced the same Mercian overlordship that had constrained his predecessor. The northern territories were still lost to Mercian control. The kingdom remained clearly subordinate to the greater power to the north. Nothing fundamental had changed with Æthelheard's death, or so it must have seemed in 740. But history has a way of producing unexpected developments that no one could have predicted. What no contemporary observer could have foreseen was that Cuthred would prove to be a very different kind of king than his cautious, accommodating predecessor. While Æthelheard had been patient and enduring, accepting constraints he could not overcome, Cuthred would eventually prove willing to take enormous risks and directly challenge Mercian authority. But that story belongs to Cuthred's own reign and takes us beyond Æthelheard's narrative. And so King Æthelheard of Wessex passed from life. His 14-year reign concluded, his struggles and endurance at an end. He was laid to rest in some now unknown location, presumably in a Christian burial with prayers for his soul. His grave perhaps marked with a stone cross or some other monument that has long since crumbled away or been lost. The man who had fought so desperately for the crown in 726, who had endured Mercian dominance and territorial losses, who had somehow maintained Wessex as a functioning kingdom through very difficult circumstances, had played his part in history and departed the stage. King Æthelheard of Wessex left behind no grand monuments to commemorate his reign, no epic poetry celebrating his deeds for future generations to recite, no revolutionary changes to law or governance that would bear his name through the centuries. He does not rank among the truly great names of Anglo-Saxon England that echo through history. When we think today of powerful, successful West Saxon kings, our minds naturally turn to figures like Alfred the Great, who saved his kingdom from Viking conquest, or Ine, whose long, prosperous reign and comprehensive law code set standards for generations, not to Æthelheard, whose reign was marked more by what he endured than by what he achieved. When we recall mighty Mercian rulers who dominated their age, we remember Offa with his famous dike marking the Welsh border and his diplomatic correspondence with Charlemagne, or Æthelbald, who held all southern England in his grip, not their West Saxon contemporary, who laboured in their shadow. Æthelheard's relative obscurity in historical memory and popular consciousness is, in many ways, the inevitable consequence of his historical position. He was a king who ruled during a period when Wessex was overshadowed and dominated by a greater power, who could not match the achievements of his predecessors or set patterns that his successors would eagerly follow. This relative obscurity and lack of lasting fame might seem like a harsh verdict on Æthelheard's reign, a judgment that he failed as a king and left nothing of value behind. Yet perhaps we should not judge Æthelheard's 14 years on the throne too harshly, or dismiss his reign as inconsequential, simply because it lacked dramatic triumphs and glorious victories. There were real achievements in his stubborn survival, genuine value in what he managed to preserve, important consequences flowing from decisions he made even under the most constraining circumstances. Consider carefully what might have happened if events had unfolded differently. Suppose the succession crisis of 726 had resulted not in Æthelheard's hard-fought victory, but in prolonged, devastating civil war that raged for years, rather than being resolved in 12 months. Suppose 2 or 3 rival claimants had continued fighting indefinitely, each refusing to yield, each determined to prevail or die trying. Such a protracted conflict could easily have torn Wessex apart, fragmenting the kingdom into competing territories controlled by various warlords, destroying the institutions that Ine had built, unraveling the social fabric that held communities together. Or suppose a weaker king than Æthelheard, someone less able to endure humiliation and frustration, had allowed Wessex to completely fragment under the relentless pressure of Mercian dominance. Suppose that instead of bending but not breaking, and maintaining basic functions of governance even while losing territory and independence, the kingdom had simply collapsed entirely, dissolved into Mercia, absorbed as provinces directly ruled by Mercian governors, losing even its nominal identity as a separate realm. Neither of these disasters occurred. The succession crisis was resolved relatively quickly with Æthelheard's victory. The kingdom held together as a functioning entity throughout his reign, despite severe external pressure. The institutions that Ine had established, the comprehensive law code, the administrative divisions, the church structure, the networks of loyalty and obligation, continued to function and were passed on intact to Æthelheard's successor, the people of Wessex, while suffering under Mercian dominance that must have been deeply frustrating to those who understood what was happening, at least knew peace within their borders, and could go about their lives without constant warfare destroying their crops and communities. This basic continuity, unglamorous, unheralded, easily overlooked by chroniclers seeking dramatic events to record, was Æthelheard's true and most important legacy. He kept the kingdom together when it might have fallen apart completely. He maintained royal authority and the structures of governance when they might have dissolved into chaos. He passed on to his successor Cuthred, a realm that was damaged and diminished, yes, but still recognizably Wessex, still possessing its own identity and traditions, and still capable of functioning as a kingdom, and therefore potentially capable of recovery when circumstances improved. Moreover, and this is crucial for understanding the longer sweep of West Saxon and English history, Æthelheard's reign set the stage for what would come after. His successor Cuthred would eventually rebel successfully against Mercian overlordship, defeating Æthelbald at the Battle of Burford in 752 and securing West Saxon independence for the remainder of his reign. This dramatic rebellion and victory was possible only because Wessex still existed as an entity capable of mounting such a challenge. Æthelheard had preserved that entity through 14 difficult years, maintaining it as a viable kingdom that still had armies to field, nobles to lead those armies, resources to sustain a military effort, and a sense of identity that made independence worth fighting for. If we look at the broader sweep of West Saxon and English history across the long 8th and 9th centuries, Æthelheard's reign appears as a difficult but necessary bridge between the golden age of Ine and the eventual revival and ultimate triumph of Wessex. Not every generation can produce greatness and achievements that will be celebrated for centuries. Some periods are necessarily marked more by struggle and survival than by accomplishment and glory. These difficult transitional periods, when kingdoms or peoples endure hard times and somehow maintain their existence despite severe challenges, are no less essential to the larger historical story than the periods of dramatic achievement and expansion that capture more attention. The sources that preserve Æthelheard's memory are frustratingly limited and often maddeningly vague. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled more than a century after his death, gives him just a handful of brief entries recording only the most basic facts: his conflict with Oswald, the loss of Somerton, his death. Medieval chroniclers writing centuries later sometimes mentioned him in passing when constructing king lists or genealogies, but they added little new information and sometimes introduced errors or confusion. Modern historians, working with these sparse materials and trying to reconstruct 8th century Wessex from fragmentary evidence, can sketch only the rough outlines of his reign, fill in some details from general knowledge of the period, but must acknowledge large gaps in our understanding. And yet even in this historical obscurity, there is something appropriate and perhaps even revealing. Æthelheard was not a king who dominated his age, who shaped events through force of personality and military prowess, who left such a powerful impression that later generations felt compelled to remember and celebrate him. He was a figure who navigated circumstances largely beyond his control as well as he could manage, who made the best of genuinely bad situations, who did his duty as he understood it, even when that duty offered little glory or satisfaction. Such kings are easily forgotten because they do not fit the heroic narrative patterns that medieval culture celebrated, and that still influence how we think about successful leadership. Anglo-Saxon poetry and prose celebrated warrior kings who won great battles and took treasure from enemies, who rewarded loyal followers generously from the spoils of conquest, who expanded their realms and struck fear into rival kingdoms, kings who endured difficult circumstances patiently, who preserved what they could rather than gaining more, who avoided catastrophic defeats rather than winning glorious victories. These did not make for inspiring poetry or memorable stories. They were necessary, but not particularly exciting. We might draw an interesting parallel between Æthelheard's relationship with his rival Oswald and the broader themes of his reign. Oswald could claim impressive royal ancestry, descent from the ancient King Ceawlin, giving him impeccable aristocratic credentials. His pedigree was beyond question, his bloodline running straight back through generations to the legendary founders of the kingdom. Yet it was Æthelheard, of uncertain and possibly humble origins, who ultimately prevailed in their struggle. This victory of the less aristocratically connected candidate over the blue-blooded claimant might suggest something important about how 8th century Wessex actually functioned beneath the surface of genealogical claims and traditional ideas about royal blood. While ancestry certainly mattered and conveyed advantages, practical considerations, military strength, political connections and alliances, the backing of powerful external supporters, sheer determination and willingness to do whatever proved necessary, could sometimes matter more than pure hereditary legitimacy. If this interpretation is correct, Æthelheard's reign might represent a transitional moment in the evolution of West Saxon kingship, the old system in which multiple branches of the royal family competed for the throne based primarily on their genealogical credentials and closeness to legendary ancestors, was perhaps giving way to a somewhat more flexible arrangement in which capable leaders could emerge and establish themselves even without absolutely perfect royal pedigree. This shift, if real, would ultimately strengthen the West Saxon monarchy by allowing it to draw on a broader pool of potential leaders and by rewarding capability and effectiveness rather than merely breeding. The question of Æthelheard's relationship to Queen Ethelberg, was he truly her brother, as some traditions claimed, making him King Ine's brother-in-law? Or was this a later invention by chroniclers trying to provide him with respectable royal connections he did not actually possess? Cannot be definitively answered with the evidence available to us, but the very ambiguity and uncertainty itself reveals something significant about Æthelheard's position. By the late 8th century, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was being compiled and the sources we rely on were taking shape, there was already confusion and debate about Æthelheard's origins and ancestry. He had become a somewhat mysterious figure whose exact family background was unclear and contested. This mystery and ambiguity may partly explain why Æthelheard made such little lasting impression on later historical memory and consciousness. Kings whose ancestry was certain and clear, whose place in royal genealogies was undisputed, whose descent from legendary founders could be traced generation by generation, fit neatly into the narrative structures that medieval chroniclers preferred. They could be easily incorporated into the grand story of kingdoms and dynasties rising and falling in comprehensible patterns, divine favor blessing royal lines that maintained their purity and legitimacy. Æthelheard, ambiguous in his origins and uncertain in his pedigree, did not fit these preferred patterns as neatly and therefore tended to be neglected or passed over quickly. Yet there is another way to read and understand Æthelheard's story that is considerably more sympathetic and perhaps more accurate to his actual character and choices. He was a man who seized a genuine opportunity when it presented itself before him. When Ine abdicated unexpectedly, and the throne of Wessex suddenly stood vacant with no clear, universally acknowledged heir waiting to claim it, Æthelheard stepped forward boldly to claim what he believed could be his. He fought hard for what he wanted, made the necessary alliances however costly they might prove, did whatever proved necessary to win. These are not the actions of a passive or weak figure lacking agency or will, but rather of someone with real determination, serious ambition, and genuine capability. Having won the crown through struggle and at considerable cost, Æthelheard then faced circumstances and challenges that would have broken many men or driven them to desperate, futile actions, to rule as a subordinate rather than a truly independent sovereign, to watch one's kingdom diminished and unable to prevent it, and to endure humiliation without being able to strike back or seek revenge, to maintain dignity and continue functioning when every development seemed to mock one's royal authority. These situations required a different kind of strength than battlefield valor or martial prowess. They required patience that bordered on the superhuman, pragmatism that accepted uncomfortable realities, and the ability to continue functioning and doing one's duty despite constant frustration and disappointment. In this more sympathetic light, Æthelheard's 14 years on the throne represent a kind of moral victory and admirable perseverance. He did not give up even when circumstances seemed nearly hopeless. He did not flee from his responsibilities as Ine had fled to Rome. He stayed at his post through thick and thin, performing his duties as king, and maintaining his dignity as best he could, keeping faith with his kingdom and his office even when his kingdom's position seemed nearly hopeless, and his office had been stripped of much of its power. This kind of stubborn endurance, this refusal to quit, deserves respect even if it makes for less exciting storytelling than battlefield victories and territorial conquests. Queen Frithugyth, too, deserves recognition and remembrance in any assessment of this period. She stood beside her husband throughout his troubled reign, providing partnership and support through years that must have been difficult and frustrating for her as well. She fulfilled her duties as queen with apparent competence and commitment. She maintained the charitable and religious activities expected of her elevated position, and she undertook the arduous, dangerous pilgrimage to Rome, demonstrating both her personal piety and her considerable courage. If we know frustratingly little about her as an individual person with thoughts and feelings and aspirations, we can at least recognize and acknowledge that she was a genuine partner in Æthelheard's struggles, and that she contributed to whatever stability and continuity his reign managed to achieve. The lack of recorded children born to Æthelheard and Frithugyth might initially be seen as yet another misfortune or failure of the reign, just as Ine's lack of an obvious heir had created the succession crisis that brought Æthelheard to power. So Æthelheard apparently produced no son who could seamlessly inherit the throne and provide continuity. Yet perhaps this absence of a direct heir was not entirely negative in its consequences. It meant that succession remained open to other branches of the royal family, or to those with some claim to royal connection, preventing the dangerous concentration of power in a single family line, and maintaining the principle that multiple candidates might legitimately compete for the crown based on various qualifications, rather than mere birth order or closest descent. When we try to assess Æthelheard's character from the limited fragmentary evidence that has survived across 12 centuries, several traits and qualities emerge with reasonable clarity. He was determined and persistent. He fought his way to the throne against a rival with better credentials, and then held that throne for 14 years despite enormous challenges. He was realistic and pragmatic. He recognized when he could not successfully resist Mercian power, and chose accommodation and survival over suicidal defiance that would have destroyed his kingdom. He was patient and enduring. He persevered through 14 years of difficult rule, maintaining his responsibilities and his position without abandoning ship or giving up in despair. And he was, measured by the metrics that truly mattered, successful. He achieved his fundamental goal of becoming and remaining King of Wessex. He maintained the kingdom through difficult times. He passed on a viable realm to his successor, even if the kingship he exercised was constrained and diminished. These are not the flashy qualities that make for thrilling historical narratives, inspiring epic poetry, or dramatic television adaptations. They are quieter virtues: determination, pragmatism, patience, persistence, a kind of stubborn refusal to quit. But they are precisely the qualities that allow institutions to survive difficult periods, that enable continuity across challenging generations, that make possible the eventual recovery and revival that later ages might achieve when circumstances improve. Æthelheard of Wessex was, in the final analysis, a king of survival rather than a king of conquest or transformation. In an age of great turmoil and uncertainty, when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were still competing for dominance and supremacy, when the power of Mercia seemed overwhelming and possibly permanent, when the future was clouded and unpredictable, he kept Wessex alive as a functioning kingdom. That this survival required accepting subordination and enduring territorial losses did not make it less important or valuable. Sometimes survival must come first, with glory and expansion waiting for more favorable times and more fortunate circumstances. The modern historian surveying the landscape of 8th century England with the enormous benefit of hindsight and knowledge of what came after can see patterns and developments and consequences that were entirely invisible to those who lived through these events. We know with certainty that Mercian supremacy, which seemed so solid and permanent to Æthelheard's generation, would eventually collapse and fade. We know that Wessex would not only recover its independence, but would rise to become the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom, would eventually absorb or subordinate all the other kingdoms, would provide the royal house from which the kings of a unified England would descend. We know that Danish invasions later in the 9th century would completely reshape the political map of England, destroying every Anglo-Saxon kingdom except Wessex, and forcing dramatic changes in how remaining Anglo-Saxons organized themselves and understood their identity. We know that eventually, by the 10th century, something recognizable as a unified English kingdom would emerge from the wreckage of the old system of competing realms. But Æthelheard could not have known any of this. He lived entirely in his present moment, facing immediate challenges and making difficult decisions based on incomplete information and the impossibility of predicting future outcomes. He could not foresee that Mercian power would eventually fail, that Wessex would rise again, that the system of overlordship and competing kingdoms would eventually give way to something new. He could only deal with the world as it actually existed during his lifetime, respond to circumstances as he found them, make choices that seemed reasonable given what he knew and the options available to him. That he made choices which preserved Wessex's existence as a distinct entity, even if he could not preserve its full independence or prevent territorial losses, deserves credit. He played the difficult hand he was dealt as well as anyone could reasonably have played it. Perhaps no king, however talented or capable, could have done significantly better given the overwhelming disparity in power between Wessex and Mercia in this period. And so Æthelheard passed into history. His reign concluded, his struggles finished, his part in the larger story played out. The memory of his rule faded quickly, preserved only in sparse chronicle entries and occasional mentions in genealogies and king lists. Later generations of West Saxons, celebrating their kingdom's eventual triumph and glory, did not look back fondly on the period of subordination to Mercia, and therefore did not celebrate the king who had presided over that difficult time. Yet his reign mattered profoundly, as every reign matters, even those that seem unsuccessful or insignificant by conventional measures. Each king, each period of rule, each generation that grapples with its particular challenges and circumstances contributes something to the larger story that unfolds across centuries. Æthelheard's specific contribution was survival. He was the king who held on tenaciously when times were genuinely hard, who preserved what he could even when expansion was impossible, who passed on to the next generation a kingdom damaged but not destroyed, diminished but still possessing its essential identity and capacity for eventual recovery. In an age when kingdoms could disappear entirely, conquered and absorbed by stronger neighbors, fragmented beyond any hope of reunification, dissolved into component parts that never cohered again, Æthelheard's Wessex endured through his 14-year reign. An endurance, as any serious student of history comes to understand, is sometimes the greatest and most valuable achievement possible, the necessary foundation upon which all future accomplishments must rest. As we bring our long and peaceful journey through the life and reign of King Æthelheard to its quiet conclusion, as we prepare to leave behind the struggles of 8th century Wessex and drift gently into restful sleep, it is worth taking a few final moments to reflect on what we have learned, what this distant story might teach us, and why these ancient struggles still matter across the vast gulf of more than 12 centuries. We began our journey in the year 726, when the great King Ine made his momentous decision to abdicate and seek salvation in Rome. leaving behind a kingdom that had known stability and prosperity for nearly 40 years. We watched as that sudden departure created a dangerous power vacuum, as two ambitious men, Æthelheard and Oswald, both stepped forward to claim the vacant throne. As their competing claims led to violence and civil war that threatened to tear Wessex apart, we saw how Æthelheard, aided crucially by Mercian support that would prove both blessing and curse, ultimately prevailed in that desperate struggle. We accompanied him as he took up the burdens and responsibilities of kingship, only to discover that the throne he had fought so hard to win came with severe constraints and limitations that no amount of determination could overcome. We witnessed the humiliation of 733 when Mercian forces seized the royal manor of Somerton, demonstrating unmistakably that Wessex had become subordinate to its more powerful neighbour. We felt the grinding frustration of Æthelheard's long struggle to maintain his kingdom's borders and identity against constant Mercian pressure that seemed impossible to resist. We met Queen Frithugyth, glimpsing briefly the domestic life of the royal household, her charitable works and religious devotion, her remarkable pilgrimage to Rome that demonstrated both faith and courage. We considered the daily work of kingship, the travelling between manors, the administration of justice, the granting of lands, the religious ceremonies, all the routine functions that kept a kingdom operating even during difficult times. We followed Æthelheard through his final years as age and circumstance took their inevitable toll, until death finally claimed him in 740, ending a reign marked more by endurance than achievement, more by survival than triumph. And we reflected on his legacy, not the dramatic, celebrated legacy of great conquerors, but the quieter, often overlooked legacy of simply maintaining continuity, preserving institutions, keeping the kingdom alive through challenging times. Throughout this long journey, we have seen that Æthelheard was neither hero nor villain, neither saint nor incompetent, but rather something more common and perhaps more human. A man trying to do his best in genuinely difficult circumstances that offered no good options, only choices between different kinds of compromise and accommodation. He was a king who ruled during a period of weakness and subordination, who could not match the achievements of illustrious predecessors or set inspiring examples for later generations, but who nonetheless served his purpose in the larger story by simply refusing to give up, by maintaining his kingdom through dark times. There is something quietly admirable in such stubborn persistence, as such refusal to surrender even when circumstances seem nearly hopeless. Æthelheard could have abdicated in despair after the loss of Somerton. He could have fled to a monastery and spent his remaining years in prayer and contemplation, leaving the kingdom's problems for someone else to deal with. He could have provoked Mercia into a final confrontation that would have destroyed Wessex, but at least ended his suffering and frustration. He did none of these things. He stayed at his post, performed his duties, maintained his dignity, and kept faith with his office and his people despite everything working against him. In our modern world, so different from 8th century Wessex in almost every way, we might still find something valuable and applicable in Æthelheard's example. We all face circumstances that constrain our choices and limit what we can achieve. We all experience periods when simply enduring, simply maintaining our commitments and responsibilities despite frustration and difficulty is the best we can realistically accomplish. We all know the feeling of struggling against forces much larger than ourselves, of trying to preserve what matters even when expansion and triumph seem impossible. Æthelheard's story reminds us that survival itself can be an achievement, that holding on during hard times creates possibilities for better times ahead, that unglamorous perseverance through difficulty deserves respect, even if it makes for less exciting storytelling than dramatic victories. Not every chapter in our lives or in the life of a kingdom can be marked by triumph and progress, and sometimes we must simply endure, must simply refuse to quit, must simply maintain what we can until circumstances improve. The kingdom Æthelheard preserved through his 14 difficult years would eventually recover and thrive. His successor, Cuthred, would rebel successfully against Mercian domination. Later, West Saxon kings would build upon the foundation that had been maintained through hard times. Eventually, Wessex would become the dominant power in England, the kingdom that would survive Viking invasions that destroyed all others, the royal house that would provide kings for a unified English realm. None of that later glory would have been possible if Wessex had ceased to exist during Æthelheard's reign, if the kingdom had fragmented or been absorbed into Mercia, if the institutions and identity had been lost. By preserving what he could, by maintaining continuity however imperfect, Æthelheard contributed to achievements and triumphs he would never live to see, but which depended fundamentally on the survival he ensured. And now, dear listener, our long journey through Æthelheard's life and times has reached its natural end. We have walked together through 14 years of Anglo-Saxon history, explored a period of challenge and subordination, met a king who endured rather than conquered. It is time now to let go of these ancient struggles, to release your grip on the details and facts and events we have explored, to allow the story to fade gently from your conscious mind as sleep claims you. Let your body relax completely, feeling the comfortable surface beneath you, supporting your weight. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and becoming steady and rhythmic. Let your thoughts drift and scatter like leaves on a gentle wind, no longer holding on to any particular idea or concern. The story of Æthelheard is told. His struggles are long finished. His reign concluded more than 12 centuries ago. The kingdom he preserved has long since vanished into the unified England that eventually emerged from those competing realms. The royal manors where he held court have crumbled into ruins, or been built over by later generations. The borders he struggled to maintain have been redrawn countless times. The people he ruled have been dust for more than a millennium. But the quiet lesson of his reign remains, that survival matters, that endurance has value, that preserving what can be preserved through difficult times creates foundations for future achievement. This lesson, drawn from the misty past of Anglo-Saxon England, can accompany you gently into sleep and rest softly in your unconscious mind, ready to provide comfort and perspective when you face your own challenges and struggles. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the weight of history, the accumulated centuries separating us from Æthelheard's time, press gently upon you like a soft blanket. Let the knowledge that countless generations have faced difficulty and endured, that kingdoms have struggled and survived, that people throughout history have simply held on through hard times, bring you peace and comfort as you drift toward dreams. The Anglo-Saxon world of the 8th century, with its warrior kings and competing realms, its Mercian supremacy and West Saxon subordination, its constant struggles and occasional triumphs, recedes now into the comfortable distance of the past. The specific details fade as sleep approaches. The dates and names, the battles and treaties, the losses and endurances all blur together and dissolve into the general flow of history. Æthelheard sleeps in his unknown grave somewhere in the soil of England, his struggles forgotten by most, his reign a footnote in the grand story. And you too can sleep now, can surrender to the gentle embrace of rest, can let consciousness fade as you join the countless billions of humans who have lived and struggled and endured and eventually found peace in sleep and rest. Good night, sweet dreamer. May the story of Æthelheard of Wessex, the disputed king who fought for his crown and then endured through 14 difficult years, carry you gently into the deepest, most restful sleep. May you find comfort in knowing that survival is itself worthy. that endurance has genuine value, that simply holding on through hard times creates possibilities for better days ahead. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream peacefully of ancient kingdoms and long ago struggles that have faded into the comfortable distance of history, until we meet again in another corner of the past, until we explore together another life and another time. Rest now in the knowledge that you have completed this journey through Æthelheard's reign. The disputed king fought for his crown, ruled as best he could, and finally rested. And now you too can rest, can sleep, can let go completely of the waking world and drift into the timeless realm, where past and present dissolve, where struggles are forgotten, where peace and rest await all who surrender to sleep's gentle embrace. Good night, sleep well, and sweet dreams of ancient Wessex, brave perseverance, and the quiet dignity of simply enduring through difficult times. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the life of King Æthelheard of Wessex. If you enjoyed this soothing historical tale, please like this video, leave a gentle comment about which medieval figure you'd like us to explore next, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more restful journeys through history. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and until next time, sleep well.